I am Kira, 34 years old, and my own family threw me out of their house on Christmas night. My mother screamed that I was a jealous thief and ordered me up to my room like a misbehaving toddler who didn't know how to behave at the dinner table. Everyone at that table laughed at the family failure, right there in front of me, like it was the funniest thing they had seen all year. I just smiled quietly and packed my single bag without a word of protest. The next morning, they found my room completely empty. Then, moments later, a lawyer burst through the front door, trembling and out of breath, and handed them an eviction notice that would change everything they thought they knew about me. Before I continue this story, let me know in the comments below where you're watching from tonight. And hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family members who badly underestimated your worth and what you were truly capable of. Growing up in a wealthy Chicago suburb meant maintaining a perfect image at all times, no matter what was actually happening behind closed doors. Inside our sprawling brick mansion, a deep emotional coldness permeated every single corner of every single room. Our house was less of a home and more of a fortress of impossible expectations that I could never quite meet, no matter how hard I tried. My entire childhood was spent living in the long shadow of my younger sister, Brittany. She was the golden child, the one who supposedly did everything right, while I was cast as the scapegoat, blamed for every misstep, every flaw, every inconvenient truth in that household. The contrast between us was exhausting to live through, but instead of breaking under it, I focused every ounce of energy on my education and quietly built a serious career in digital data investigation and cybersecurity. I never once told my family that my small consulting firm had grown year after year into a multi-million-dollar luxury asset management and security company. To them, I would always be just a struggling computer geek renting a tiny apartment downtown, someone barely getting by. This particular Christmas dinner was supposed to be a quiet, uneventful evening at my parents' house. My mother, Patricia, had spent the entire week bragging endlessly about Brittany and her husband, DeAndre. DeAndre is a genuinely hard-working high school principal, an honest man who puts in 14-hour days just to provide for his family. He sat quietly at the table that night, looking utterly exhausted but still smiling politely as Brittany chattered on about their supposed plans to buy a new house. The dining room was filled with the warm smell of roasted turkey and expensive wine. I sat at the far end of the long mahogany table, quietly eating my meal and doing my best to ignore the string of passive-aggressive comments my mother kept directing my way all evening. Then, without any warning at all, Brittany dropped her fork onto her plate and let out a dramatic, piercing sob that cut through the entire room. The whole table fell dead silent instantly. My father, Richard, dropped his napkin in surprise and asked her what on earth was wrong. Brittany pulled out her phone, her hands shaking violently, almost too dramatically. She pointed a manicured finger straight down the length of the table at me. She screamed that I had just hacked into her joint bank account. She wailed that their entire down payment for the new house was gone, completely wiped out, vanished, and that I was the one who had stolen every last cent of it. The accusation was so absurd that I actually chuckled out loud, which turned out to be the single worst possible reaction I could have had in that moment. My mother, Patricia, instantly slammed her crystal wine glass down onto the table with a violent crack. The dark red liquid splashed across the pristine white tablecloth like a stain of blood. She stood up from her chair, her face twisted into an expression of absolute fury. She did not ask for any proof. She did not ask for my side of the story. She simply launched straight into a vicious, venomous tirade aimed entirely at me. She screamed that I was a jealous failure who could not stand to see her younger sister happy for once in her life. She loudly reminded the entire family how I could never even keep a man, how I was clearly destined to live alone forever in my pathetic little downtown apartment, and how my supposed jealousy had finally turned me into a common criminal. She yelled that I had purposely ruined their perfect Christmas because I was still bitter that DeAndre had chosen Brittany instead of an unlovable woman like me. Every word was carefully chosen venom, meant to break me down completely in front of everyone. DeAndre looked entirely confused by the whole spectacle. He stood up from his chair and walked slowly toward his wife. He gently touched Brittany on the shoulder and calmly asked her to hand him the phone so he could see for himself. He said, quite reasonably, that they needed to look at the actual bank statements right away and call the fraud department immediately to track the routing numbers involved. But the moment he reached for the device, Brittany snatched it away from him and shoved it deep into her purse, out of sight. She began hyperventilating dramatically, screaming that I was a dangerous hacker and that letting anyone touch the phone would only give me the chance to steal their identity too. She buried her face in her hands, putting on a flawless, practiced performance of a terrified victim. DeAndre stood there frozen, his hand still outstretched toward her, a flicker of genuine doubt crossing his tired, worn-down face. He asked her again, gently, to just show him the screen. I sat perfectly still, my eyes locked directly on Brittany the entire time. I knew exactly what she was hiding inside that purse. I knew, with total certainty, that she had manually drained her own account herself and now desperately needed a convenient scapegoat to blame. Patricia, completely absorbed in her own rage, did not notice her son-in-law's growing hesitation at all. She turned her furious gaze right back to me, her chest heaving with cold, self-righteous indignation, and pointed a trembling finger toward the grand staircase in the hallway, preparing to deliver her final, most humiliating punishment yet. Patricia pointed her trembling index finger directly at the grand staircase leading up to the second floor. She ordered me to march up to my old childhood bedroom immediately and stay there like a grounded teenager who had broken curfew. She screamed that I was strictly forbidden from rejoining the holiday celebration downstairs until I personally wrote a check to fully refund Brittany for every single stolen penny. The sheer audacity of treating a 34-year-old, financially independent woman like a disobedient toddler was completely mind-boggling to witness. I sat there calmly, refusing to give her unhinged delusion the satisfaction of any emotional outburst whatsoever. Patricia slammed her hands onto the table again, leaning forward so far that her pearl necklace dangled dangerously close to her gravy-covered plate. She demanded my immediate compliance, raising her voice to a shrill, ear-splitting pitch that echoed all through the massive house. Richard puffed out his chest and stepped forward to back up his irrational, furious wife. He pointed a menacing finger at me and loudly threatened to call the local police department on his own flesh and blood. He stated, with disgusting self-satisfaction, that keeping this whole matter inside the family was a generous favor that I absolutely did not deserve. He warned me that if I did not immediately march upstairs and surrender the allegedly stolen funds, he would happily stand back and watch the authorities drag me out of his mansion in shiny silver handcuffs. He crossed his arms defensively, trying his best to look intimidating while defending his clearly deceitful younger daughter. The blind, unconditional loyalty they so freely offered Brittany, while offering me none at all, was genuinely sickening to witness up close. I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice in protest, not even once. I simply shifted my gaze away from my furious, red-faced parents and looked directly at the smug, victorious little smile creeping across Brittany's perfectly contoured face. She knew exactly what she was doing. She was actively, deliberately destroying my reputation in order to save herself from the severe financial and legal consequences of her own crimes. Then, slowly, I turned my attention to DeAndre. He looked completely defeated, thoroughly panicked, and entirely exhausted. The heavy weight of his stressful career, combined with his wife's manufactured crisis, was visibly crushing him right there in the middle of the dining room. He genuinely believed, in that moment, that his dream of buying a home for his family had just evaporated into thin air, gone forever. I smoothly pushed my chair back from the heavy table and stood up. I smoothed the wrinkles from my elegant black dress with both hands. I looked, one final time, at the three people who had turned my childhood into an absolute living nightmare, year after year. I simply said the word, "Fine." I turned on my heel and walked toward the grand staircase with perfect, unbothered posture, refusing to give them a single crack of visible emotion. I did not look back once as I ascended the carpeted steps, my footsteps completely silent. I could feel their hateful glares burning into my back the entire way up, but their toxic opinions no longer held any real power over me anymore. I reached the landing, walked into my old room, and quietly closed the bedroom door behind me. Downstairs, the heavy tension instantly vanished the moment I disappeared from their sight. I could clearly hear the joyous clinking of crystal glasses resuming almost immediately in the dining room below. My parents began laughing loudly together, celebrating the fact that they had successfully put the family failure back in her proper place, once and for all. They loudly comforted Brittany, praising her for being so incredibly brave while surviving such a terrible, traumatic betrayal. They quickly poured themselves more expensive wine and continued their lavish Christmas feast without me, without a second thought. They genuinely believed, in their smug little bubble, that they had won the war completely. They assumed I was sitting alone upstairs in the dark, weeping silently and desperately writing a massive apology letter to beg for their forgiveness. Upstairs, the hidden reality was entirely different from anything they could have imagined. I did not reach for a pen to write a fraudulent refund check. I calmly reached into my leather tote bag instead and pulled out my heavily encrypted work laptop. The sleek silver machine booted up almost instantly, bathing the dark bedroom in a cool, steady blue light. I did not feel any lingering sadness or painful regret in that moment. I only felt cold, calculating precision, sharpened by years of quiet preparation. I quickly bypassed the complex security protocols and opened my private files. I stared for a long moment at the highly sensitive documents I had compiled several weeks earlier, back when I first suspected that Brittany was committing massive financial fraud behind closed doors, right under everyone's noses. I opened a blank email draft addressed directly to Mr. Gallagher, the senior attorney who managed the entire family estate. I carefully attached the irrefutable digital proof of Brittany's illegal offshore gambling transfers, file by file. I also attached the finalized real estate documents, proving beyond any doubt that my corporate acquisitions firm had legally purchased the defaulted mortgage on this exact suburban mansion months earlier. I did not type out a single heartfelt apology to my deeply abusive family. I simply typed 3 short words into the subject line to trigger the final legal protocol, nothing more. I firmly clicked the send button. Immediately, calmly, watching the small confirmation icon flash across my bright computer screen for a brief second. The small confirmation icon dissolved quietly into the background of my desktop, sealing the fate of everyone downstairs without any of them realizing it yet. I slowly closed the heavy encrypted laptop and slid it back into my sleek leather tote. I did not waste any time looking around the childhood bedroom that had served as my personal prison for 18 long years. I unzipped my single overnight bag. I packed the one formal dress I had brought along for tomorrow, my luxury cosmetics, and the few files I needed for my morning meetings the next day. Before zipping the bag shut for good, my mind flashed back briefly to the raw financial data I had just forwarded to the family attorney. The numbers were staggering. The numbers were undeniable. The numbers painted a perfect, damning portrait of my sister's deep financial corruption. Brittany had not simply drained the house down payment tonight, on a whim. She had been systematically siphoning funds from DeAndre's hard-earned savings account for over 9 straight months, quietly, patiently, without him ever suspecting a thing. She funneled every single dollar into a shady offshore casino registered in Cyprus. She placed reckless bets on high-stakes poker games while her exhausted husband worked overtime, night after night, just to give her the world she demanded. She lost it all. She lost his money. She lost her dignity. She lost her mind. Somewhere along the way. And now she was trying, with everything she had, to ensure that I lost my freedom instead, just to cover her own tracks. But the offshore gambling records were only the appetizer in the digital dossier I had just unleashed downstream. The main course was the certified property deed, securely saved on my hard drive for months. The beautiful suburban mansion downstairs, the very house where Patricia currently reigned supreme like a queen, no longer belonged to Richard at all. My father had quietly taken out a massive, predatory second mortgage 3 years earlier to fund Brittany's failing boutique business, hoping desperately it would finally make her successful. He defaulted on those payments 6 months ago, unable to keep up. A private acquisitions firm swooped in and bought the debt for pennies on the dollar. That ruthless, efficient firm foreclosed on the property at exactly midnight, 2 days before this very Christmas dinner. That firm was entirely owned and operated by me. I own the walls enclosing them. I own the floor beneath their feet. I own the roof over their heads, every single shingle of it, and they had no idea. I walked over to the large bay window at the far end of the room. I unlocked the brass latch and pushed the heavy glass pane upward with both hands. A blast of freezing Chicago winter air rushed instantly into the stale, overheated bedroom. I grabbed my leather tote and my overnight bag, hoisting them carefully over the windowsill one at a time. I swung my legs over the ledge and stepped down onto the sturdy, shingled roof of the lower sunroom below. The icy wind bit sharply into my cheeks, but the physical discomfort was nothing at all compared to the emotional suffocation I was finally, permanently, leaving behind me. I crouched low, keeping my balance carefully on the slanted roof, and navigated toward the thick wooden trellis attached to the side of the brick house. I climbed down the wooden trellis with calculated, practiced precision. My boots found the wooden slats perfectly, even in the pitch darkness. I had used this exact escape route countless times before, as a miserable teenager, fleeing Patricia's endless criticisms whenever the walls of that house closed in too tightly around me. I reached the solid, frozen ground and landed softly on the snow-covered grass below. I did not look back at the brightly illuminated windows of the dining room, not even once. I walked straight down the long, dark, winding driveway toward the quiet, snow-covered suburban street beyond. The freezing night air filled my lungs crisp and clean, and finally, truly, entirely mine alone. A sleek black town car sat idling silently at the curb, its headlights cutting sharp lines through the falling snow. The uniformed driver immediately stepped out and opened the heavy rear door for me without a word. I slid into the luxurious heated leather interior, tossing my bags onto the empty seat beside me. The driver closed the door gently, sealing me inside a quiet sanctuary of wealth and absolute security, far from everything I had just walked away from. He glanced at me through the rearview mirror, asking politely for my destination. I looked out through the tinted window at the sprawling brick house one final time, memorizing it. I told the driver to take me straight to my penthouse in the financial district. The heavy car pulled smoothly away from the curb, leaving the toxic wreckage of my family far behind in the falling snow, exactly where it belonged. Back inside the brightly lit dining room downstairs, my mother, Patricia, was eagerly pouring herself another very generous glass of incredibly expensive Merlot, completely unaware of what had just happened above her head. She stood proudly at the head of the table, commanding the full attention of my enabling relatives, one last time. She gloated loudly, her voice ringing with pure, unfiltered triumph through the room. She loudly told her captive audience that she had finally put the family failure firmly back in her place, once and for all. She bragged endlessly about her excellent parenting, claiming that her strict discipline would finally force me to respect my successful younger sister. She happily raised her glass and proudly toasted to Brittany's future house, remaining completely, blissfully unaware that she had just permanently lost her own home in the process. The freezing Chicago night eventually gave way to a blindingly bright Christmas morning. Sunlight poured through the expensive stained glass windows of the suburban mansion, reflecting brilliantly off the crystal ornaments hanging from the massive evergreen tree in the foyer. Patricia woke up with a slight headache, but with an overwhelming sense of deep, selfish purpose still burning inside her. She had spent the entire previous night gloating about her superior parenting skills and her brilliant younger daughter. Now it was finally time to finalize her triumph completely. She marched into Richard's home office and snatched a blank checkbook from the heavy oak desk. She grabbed a thick black pen, her manicured fingers gripping the plastic tightly, almost eagerly. She fully intended to march upstairs, shove the pen into my hand, and force me to drain my meager savings to refund Brittany every last cent. She genuinely believed, with total confidence, that I was still sitting in my old childhood bed, trembling with shame and ready to beg for her forgiveness. Patricia stomped up the grand curved staircase, her heavy footsteps thudding loudly against the plush carpet with every step. She did not bother to knock gently or announce her presence in any way. She raised her foot and kicked the white wooden door open with startling, unnecessary violence. The heavy door slammed against the interior wall with a deafening crack that echoed all the way down the long hallway. Patricia stepped into the room, raising the blank check like a weapon, her mouth already opened wide to unleash a fresh wave of verbal abuse at me. The cruel words died instantly in her throat, unspoken. The bedroom was completely silent and entirely spotless. The floral bedspread was perfectly made. The pillows were fluffed and arranged with military precision, exactly as they had been for years. Not a single item of clothing was draped over the chair. Not a single personal belonging rested on the wooden dresser. The only disruption in the entire immaculate space was the large bay window at the far end of the room. It was pushed wide open. A freezing, bitter wind howled steadily through the gap, billowing the sheer white curtains violently into the room and dusting the hardwood floor below with a thin layer of fresh snow. Patricia stood frozen in the doorway for 3 agonizing, silent seconds before the reality of the situation finally registered fully in her brain. She dropped the blank checkbook onto the floor with a soft thud. She let out a piercing, hysterical scream that tore straight through the quiet holiday morning air. She screamed for Richard, her voice cracking apart with pure, unfiltered panic. Down the hall, doors flew open one after another. Richard stumbled out quickly, tying his silk robe clumsily and looking utterly disoriented. Brittany and DeAndre rushed out of the guest bedroom together, their faces pale with sudden shock. They sprinted down the corridor and crowded together into the doorway of my old room. Richard stared blankly at the made bed and at the snow blowing steadily through the open window. He loudly demanded to know what on earth was going on. Brittany took one single look at the empty room and immediately launched straight into a spectacular theatrical performance of her own. She dropped to her knees right there on the carpet, clutching her chest dramatically, as if she had just been physically struck by something. She began sobbing uncontrollably, forcing massive tears down her perfectly painted, tearful face. She wailed that I had escaped. She screamed that I must have booked a direct flight ticket out of the country in the middle of the night, fleeing like a coward. She frantically pointed at the open window, claiming loudly that I was a cowardly fugitive who had fled the state with her stolen down payment money. She sobbed that they would never see their money again, and that their dreams of buying a home were now permanently destroyed forever, all because of my malicious jealousy. DeAndre stepped past his hysterical, sobbing wife and walked slowly toward the open window instead. He shivered visibly as the freezing air hit his face directly. He looked out carefully at the snowy roof below and at the wooden trellis leading all the way down to the ground. He looked back at his wife, his exhausted eyes narrowing sharply with genuine, growing confusion. He pointed out quite calmly that it was 10 degrees below zero outside that morning. He rationally stated that no one simply climbs out of a second-story window in the middle of a blizzard unless they have a very specific, highly coordinated escape plan already worked out in advance. He tried gently to suggest that they were clearly missing some massive piece of the puzzle here. Patricia completely ignored DeAndre and his perfectly logical assessment of the situation. She was practically vibrating with rage and wounded indignation at this point. She absolutely refused to be outsmarted by the daughter she had always viewed as a complete and total failure. She reached into the pocket of her silk robe and pulled out her smartphone with a trembling hand. She loudly declared to the room that she was putting an end to this nonsense immediately. She announced to the entire gathered family that she was calling the authorities right now to report a grand larceny and demand a statewide manhunt for my immediate arrest. She unlocked the screen, her thumb hovering aggressively over the emergency dial button, ready to strike. Before her manicured finger could even touch the glass, the heavy oak front door downstairs was hammered suddenly with frantic, incredibly loud knocks that echoed up through the entire house. Sitting comfortably in the heated leather seat of my town car, I calmly pulled out my tablet and connected to the hidden security cameras I had quietly installed throughout my parents' house years earlier, just in case. The high-definition live feed loaded instantly onto my screen without a single hitch. I had a perfect crystal-clear view of the grand foyer just as the heavy oak front door was hammered again, with frantic, incredibly loud knocks. The violent sound echoed through the entire mansion, freezing my family completely in their tracks, right where they stood. Upstairs on the landing, Patricia let her smartphone slip from her fingers and drop onto the plush carpet below. Her face instantly twisted, shifting from raw panic into a triumphant, predatory smile that spread slowly across her lips. She genuinely believed, with total certainty, that the authorities had somehow miraculously arrived to hunt down her fugitive daughter and drag her home. She clutched the polished wooden banister and leaned far over the railing, her eyes wide and glittering with malicious excitement. She shouted down to Richard, ordering him to answer the door immediately, without delay. She yelled that the police must have intercepted my flight at the airport and brought their stolen money safely back home to its rightful owners. Richard stood at the base of the grand staircase, tightening the belt of his expensive silk robe with quick, jerky movements. He puffed out his chest, attempting to project the confident image of a powerful patriarch who was entirely in control of this chaotic holiday morning. Even though his hands were faintly trembling, he marched toward the entryway, his heavy leather slippers slapping loudly against the polished marble floor with every determined step. Brittany and DeAndre rushed together to the top of the stairs, peering nervously down at the unfolding spectacle below. Brittany quickly wiped away her fake tears, mentally preparing herself to play the traumatized victim once again for whatever law enforcement officers stood waiting on the other side of the heavy wood door. Richard reached for the brass handle, twisted back the deadbolt, and yanked the massive door wide open with one forceful motion. The freezing winter wind instantly howled into the warm foyer, carrying thick flurries of blinding white snow across the expensive imported rugs beneath their feet. Standing on the frozen concrete porch, however, was not a team of detectives holding my confiscated luggage as everyone had expected. It was Mr. Gallagher, the senior attorney, who had faithfully managed our family estate for over 2 decades. He looked absolutely miserable standing there in the cold. Despite the bitter, biting chill of the Chicago blizzard swirling around him, nervous sweat was visibly pouring down his pale, wrinkled forehead. His expensive wool overcoat was dusted heavily with snow, and he clutched a thick, heavy leather binder tightly against his chest, as though his very life depended on holding onto it. He was breathing hard, shifting his weight anxiously from foot to foot, radiating pure discomfort and dread. He looked, quite simply, completely terrified of what was about to unfold. Standing directly behind him, looking stern and entirely unmoved by the freezing temperatures, were two uniformed city police officers. Their hands rested casually near their duty belts, ready for anything. The flashing blue and red lights from their patrol car parked at the curb painted the snowy front yard with an eerie, rhythmic glow that pulsed across the mansion's brick facade. Richard stared at the shivering lawyer, his arrogant, confident posture instantly faltering under the weight of confusion. He demanded to know what on earth Mr. Gallagher thought he was doing at his home at this ungodly hour on Christmas morning. He quickly glanced over at the two stoic police officers, assuming, in his usual self-assured way, that they were simply there as a courtesy, ready to take his official report regarding my alleged grand larceny. Richard aggressively gestured for the trembling lawyer to step inside at once, loudly complaining that they were letting all the expensive heat escape through the open door. He stated flatly that the legal team and the police were exactly who he needed to finally handle his rogue, criminal daughter once and for all. Patricia did not even give the poor attorney a single chance to cross the threshold properly. She came charging down the grand staircase like a rabid animal unleashed, completely abandoning the polished social pleasantries she usually forced upon guests at their exclusive country club. She marched straight up to the uniformed police officers, her silk robe billowing wildly behind her with every furious step. She aggressively pointed her manicured finger up toward the empty second floor and launched immediately into her fabricated, hysterical story. She demanded that the officers issue a statewide arrest warrant for me on the spot. She shrieked that I was a dangerous, manipulative thief who had just stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars from her innocent, vulnerable younger daughter. She demanded they track my phone, freeze every one of my bank accounts, and drag me back to this house in shackles before the day was over. She insisted they launch a full criminal investigation into my consulting business, loudly claiming it was obviously nothing more than a front for some kind of organized cybercrime syndicate. Brittany chimed in dutifully from the top of the stairs, letting out another theatrical sob timed perfectly to punctuate her mother's wild, baseless accusations below. DeAndre simply stood completely still, his eyes darting nervously between the sweating attorney and the two stoic police officers. His sharp intuition finally began to tell him that this unexpected holiday visit had absolutely nothing at all to do with me. Mr. Gallagher did not acknowledge a single word of Patricia's unhinged rant. He simply raised his trembling, gloved hand into the freezing air, silently demanding absolute quiet. He refused, pointedly, to even look in Patricia's direction. He looked directly and only at Richard, taking a slow, steadying breath before he finally spoke. "I am not here for Kira," Mr. Gallagher said, his voice shaking slightly. "I am here to serve you this eviction notice. You have exactly 2 hours to vacate these premises." The sentence landed like a physical blow, echoing heavily through the entire sprawling mansion and freezing every single member of my family in their tracks, exactly where they stood. Patricia stared blankly at the bold official signature printed across the embossed document Mr. Gallagher now held out toward Richard. The letters clearly spelled out my exact name, but her arrogant mind violently rejected the information, refusing to process it. She let out a sharp, humorless laugh that carried absolutely no real amusement behind it. She reached out and ruthlessly slapped the heavy leather binder straight out of the stunned attorney's trembling hands. The binder hit the marble floor with a loud crack, scattering financial records and legal eviction notices across the entryway in a messy fan. She had completely lost whatever fragile grip on reality she still had left, She stepped forward, screaming that this entire thing was an elaborate, sick forgery designed to torment her. She yelled that her pathetic, talentless daughter could never possibly afford a multi-million-dollar suburban estate like this one. She turned her rage directly onto Mr. Gallagher, accusing him outright of participating in some kind of cruel, illegal prank. She insisted the entire stack of paperwork scattered across her floor was nothing but a malicious fabrication, designed specifically to ruin her perfect Christmas morning. Richard stood frozen in place, staring down at the scattered foreclosure documents bearing his own forged, familiar signatures from years earlier. Patricia did not wait even a moment for her husband to react or intervene. She lunged forward instead, her silk robe flying wildly around her. She shoved both of her manicured hands directly into the chest of the nearest uniformed police officer with startling force. She demanded that both officers immediately vacate her private property. She tried physically to push the tall, heavily armed officer backward through the open doorway and out into the freezing snow beyond. She screamed that they were trespassing on her land and threatened, quite absurdly, to have their badges revoked by morning. The officer she had assaulted did not stumble backward even an inch. He planted his boots firmly on the icy concrete porch and instantly dropped his hand toward his utility belt in a practiced motion. He warned Patricia in a low, commanding voice that she was currently assaulting a sworn law enforcement officer. He bluntly informed her that if she laid a single hand on him one more time, she would be spending her holiday locked inside a county holding cell instead of her mansion. His partner stepped forward to back up the severe warning, pointing a stern finger directly at my mother and firmly advising her to step away from the door immediately. He stated clearly that they were not there to entertain her fantasies or delusions. They were legally obligated, he said, to execute a lawful eviction order mandated by the state of Illinois. He warned her that resisting this specific court order would result in the immediate arrest of every single adult currently standing inside that residence. Patricia froze completely, her hands hovering in the freezing air, suddenly and genuinely terrified by the very real threat of public humiliation and jail time on Christmas Day. Every ounce of aggressive fight instantly drained out of her body. She stumbled backward, her mouth opening and closing repeatedly without producing a single coherent sound. Into this sudden, tense silence, DeAndre finally stepped forward. He walked past a completely stunned Richard and a visibly hyperventilating Patricia without a word. He knelt down calmly onto the cold marble floor. He carefully gathered up the scattered legal documents one by one, entirely ignoring Mr. Gallagher's weak, half-hearted protests. DeAndre stood back up, his face devoid of any visible emotion, and began reading through the dense financial paperwork line by line, methodically. DeAndre had always been a meticulous man, one who understood numbers and spreadsheets far better than he ever understood his wife's chaotic, dysfunctional family. He flipped past the official foreclosure notices and focused instead entirely on the original loan documents attached to the property deed. He read the exact date that Richard had secured the massive second mortgage against the house. He read through the specific punishing terms of the predatory loan agreement. He then found the attached bank transfer receipts, showing exactly where every dollar of that borrowed money had actually gone. The funds, it turned out, had been wired directly into an account registered under Brittany's failed boutique business. DeAndre stopped breathing for a moment. He stared hard at the bold numbers printed across the bank transfer confirmation in his hands. He read the total amount twice, then read it a third time, just to make absolutely sure he was not hallucinating the figures out of sheer exhaustion. The exact sum of money that Richard had desperately borrowed to save Brittany's failing store matched, dollar for dollar. The exact sum of money that Brittany had sworn she needed for their new house down payment. The timeline lined up perfectly, piece by devastating piece. 9 months earlier, Brittany had tearfully begged him to empty out his entire savings account, swearing on everything she held dear that she needed the cash to secure their dream home together. Instead, she had quietly funneled his entire life savings toward covering the massive debts piling up from her failing boutique, effectively stealing from her own husband simply to hide her own financial failures from the world. DeAndre slowly lowered the stack of papers to his side. A quiet, hardening realization of utter betrayal settled deep into his features. He turned his head and looked directly at his wife across the foyer. Brittany stood frozen at the base of the staircase, unable to move. She completely avoided his intense, questioning eyes, staring firmly down at the floor instead, as every last trace of color drained from her face. She knew, in that instant, that she had finally been caught in an inescapable trap entirely of her own making. Before DeAndre could demand a single word of explanation for the stolen money, Patricia shattered the tense silence once again. She clapped her hands together sharply with frantic, unhinged energy. She aggressively ordered everyone in the room to pack their bags immediately. She loudly declared that they were all going to drive downtown, storm my penthouse apartment, and violently put an end to this ridiculous prank once and for all. Patricia snatched the heavy embossed business card Mr. Gallagher had dropped onto the marble floor and waved the small white rectangle through the air like some kind of battle flag. She forcefully ordered her stunned husband to go retrieve the luxury SUV from the heated garage right away. She shoved her sobbing daughter and her silent, shell-shocked son-in-law out the front door and directly into the blinding blizzard outside. Richard gripped the leather steering wheel tightly, his knuckles turning bone-white as he carefully navigated the treacherous, ice-covered suburban roads toward downtown Chicago. The tension inside the heated vehicle was absolutely suffocating, thick enough to cut with a knife. DeAndre sat frozen in the back seat, staring intensely out through the tinted window at the falling snow rushing past. His mind raced violently, silently calculating the massive scale of financial devastation his own wife had secretly orchestrated behind his back for nearly a year. Brittany sat as far away from him as physically possible within the confined space, pressing her shoulder hard against the cold glass window. She chewed nervously on her manicured thumbnail, utterly terrified of the inevitable confrontation still waiting for her somewhere ahead. Patricia, completely oblivious to the collapsing marriage unraveling quietly in the back seat, rode up front in the passenger seat, aggressively tapping the glossy business card against the dashboard again and again. She loudly complained about my supposed audacity the entire drive. She assured Richard, with total confidence, that they were heading toward some rundown, roach-infested studio apartment. She vowed to kick down my flimsy wooden door, drag me out by my hair if necessary, and force me to undo this ridiculous, elaborate real estate prank once and for all. Richard followed the glowing blue line on the GPS dashboard screen carefully. The luxury SUV left the quiet, snow-blanketed suburbs behind and merged onto the highway heading straight toward downtown Chicago. As the city skyline slowly loomed closer and closer through the windshield, the neighborhoods did not deteriorate into the rundown slums Patricia had so confidently predicted. Instead, the GPS calmly directed Richard to exit deep into the very heart of the elite financial district. The snow kept falling heavily as Richard turned down a pristine, meticulously plowed avenue lined on both sides with massive corporate headquarters and international banking towers. He slowed the heavy vehicle down to a crawl, staring in confusion at the navigation screen glowing in front of him. The calm, robotic voice finally announced that they had reached their destination. Richard parked the SUV carefully along the curb, its tires crunching softly against the freshly salted asphalt below. The family stepped out together into the biting, freezing wind. They stood together on the immaculate sidewalk and slowly craned their necks upward. They did not see, as expected, a crumbling brick apartment building rising above them. Instead, they stood at the base of a towering, ultra-modern glass skyscraper. The massive architectural marvel pierced straight through the low gray winter clouds overhead. Its sleek, mirrored facade reflected the surrounding city lights back at them, radiating an unmistakable aura of absolute, untouchable wealth and corporate power. Patricia crossed her arms tightly over her thin silk robe, shivering violently in the bitter cold, but stubbornly refusing to accept the reality towering directly above her. She scoffed loudly, adjusting her heavy winter coat with irritation, and confidently declared that the GPS system had clearly malfunctioned. When Richard silently pointed toward the address boldly engraved into the marble pillar beside the entrance, Patricia quickly shifted her narrative without missing a beat. She sneered that I must be renting some windowless broom closet down in the basement, just to pretend I lived in a respectable zip code for appearance's sake. She stomped aggressively toward the gleaming revolving glass doors, her family trailing silently and nervously behind her. The lobby inside was a vast, echoing cavern of imported Italian marble, brushed steel accents, and sleek minimalist leather furniture arranged with careful precision. A massive, abstract sculpture dominated the exact center of the room, catching the light from every angle. Security checkpoints equipped with glowing digital scanners blocked casual access to the polished silver elevator banks beyond. Patricia marched straight past the expensive artwork without a glance and approached the sprawling front desk with purpose. A sharply dressed security guard stood waiting behind the high marble counter, wearing a crisp, tailored suit and a discreet earpiece that projected an image of serious, high-end corporate security. Patricia slammed her open palm flat against the cold marble surface. She leaned forward aggressively, glaring fiercely at the calm, polite guard standing before her. She demanded that he immediately page her daughter, Kira. She referred to me explicitly as a mere tenant and loudly demanded my specific apartment number, insisting she needed to go upstairs and handle a private family dispute right away. The security guard maintained his calm, thoroughly professional demeanor throughout, unbothered by her hostility. He politely asked for my full legal name in return. He turned his attention to the sleek, glowing monitor embedded into the desk in front of him, his fingers flying silently across the keyboard. He studied the screen for a long moment, a slight frown creasing his forehead as he read. He looked back up at the furious woman standing before him and calmly informed Patricia that she was mistaken. He stated clearly that this particular building was strictly commercial in nature. He confirmed that no one named Kira rented any residential apartments anywhere on the premises. Patricia instantly threw her head back and laughed sharply, the sound echoing off the marble walls. She turned toward Richard, her eyes flashing with pure, vindictive triumph at having been proven right. She loudly proclaimed that she had known all along I was nothing but a lying, homeless vagrant. She prepared herself to demand that the guard throw me out onto the street the moment they found me. The security guard smiled politely, almost apologetically, before delivering his next line. She actually owns the entire top 3 floors of commercial real estate in this building. You'll need an appointment to access the executive suite. Patricia stood absolutely paralyzed on the spot, the guard's polite yet utterly devastating words echoing loudly through the vast, polished marble lobby around her. Her jaw hung unhinged, completely unable to form any kind of coherent response to the impossible new reality that her discarded, disowned daughter now owned some of the most expensive commercial real estate in the entire city. Richard stepped forward, pushing past his frozen, speechless wife, demanding loudly to speak with whoever was actually in charge of this building. The guard simply tapped his earpiece once, listened silently for a brief moment, and nodded sharply in response. He gestured toward a sleek silver door hidden behind a curved wall of frosted glass, stating quietly that Miss Wilson had graciously authorized their unexpected arrival personally. Two massive security personnel in tailored black suits materialized seemingly out of the shadows, flanking the family closely and silently, directing them all toward a private express elevator waiting nearby. The ride upward was suffocatingly quiet, nobody willing to speak first. DeAndre stared fixedly at the digital floor display as the numbers climbed higher and higher, bypassing floor after floor of standard corporate offices below. Brittany nervously twisted her expensive wedding ring around and around her finger, her earlier theatrical confidence having completely evaporated somewhere along the drive downtown. Patricia aggressively smoothed down her silk robe again and again, her face flushing with a toxic mixture of extreme humiliation and boiling, barely contained rage. The heavy silver elevator doors finally slid open with a soft, polite chime, revealing a world of unimaginable opulence that instantly left Richard completely speechless. They stepped out onto pristine imported white oak flooring that stretched endlessly down a massive, gleaming corridor. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a truly breathtaking panoramic view of the entire snow-covered Chicago skyline spread out below them. Expensive original modern art pieces hung under perfectly calibrated gallery lighting along the walls. Assistants dressed in sharp professional attire moved quietly between glass-walled offices, operating with a quiet, ruthless efficiency that felt almost military. This was not a rented workspace, temporary or otherwise. This was an empire, built brick by brick, deal by deal. Richard stared at the custom architectural details around him, his mind desperately trying to calculate the staggering wealth required to simply lease a space like this, let alone own it outright, free and clear. His own manufacturing company's headquarters suddenly looked like a dilapidated warehouse by comparison to this executive fortress of glass and steel. The silent security escorts quickly guided the family down the main corridor, their heavy footsteps completely muffled by thick, extremely expensive hand-woven runner rugs beneath their feet. They approached a massive set of double-glass doors positioned at the very end of the hallway. The escorts pushed the doors open in unison, revealing an enormous, spectacular boardroom suspended high above the city skyline. The space was dominated by a flawless 20-foot solid mahogany table that gleamed brilliantly under modern geometric lighting fixtures overhead. Sitting alone at the head of the massive table was Kira. She looked entirely different from the quiet, accommodating daughter they had cruelly banished years earlier. She wore a fiercely sharp, custom-tailored charcoal suit that radiated absolute power and total control with every line of its cut. Her posture was relaxed but unmistakably commanding. She held a sleek black ceramic mug loosely in one hand, taking a slow, deliberate sip of black coffee as they entered. She did not bother to stand up to greet them. She did not offer even the faintest polite smile. She simply watched them enter her domain with the cold, calculating eyes of a predator, quietly observing trapped prey that had finally wandered into her territory. Richard hesitated right at the threshold, deeply intimidated by the sheer, overwhelming display of raw financial power surrounding him on every side. DeAndre walked in slowly behind him, carefully assessing the room and the woman who had so effortlessly orchestrated their family's total downfall in the space of a single night. Brittany shrank back behind her husband, wishing desperately she could simply disappear into the expensive woodwork paneling the walls. Patricia, however, possessed no such capacity for self-awareness or shame, not even now. The sheer obscene luxury of the room acted like gasoline poured directly onto the already burning fire of her bruised, wounded ego. She stormed into the boardroom without pause, her heavy slippers slapping loudly and repeatedly against the polished wood floor with every furious step. She marched straight toward the head of the long table, her face contorted into an expression of absolute, unfiltered fury. Without hesitation, she violently slammed both of her bare hands flat against the gleaming, polished mahogany surface. The loud crack of impact echoed sharply off the surrounding glass walls, bouncing back through the vast room, but Kira did not even flinch at the sound. She simply took another slow, unhurried sip of her coffee, as though nothing at all had happened. Patricia leaned forward across the table, her voice rising into a screeching, desperate command that filled the entire boardroom. She demanded that Kira immediately stop this absurd, malicious game she was playing. She loudly ordered her to instantly sign the Beacon Hill property deed back over to Richard right now, insisting that this entire situation was nothing more than an illegal, fraudulent mistake that needed correcting at once. She shrieked that Kira was a deeply ungrateful, vicious child who had absolutely no right whatsoever to steal her own family's home over some pathetic, lingering childhood grudge she refused to let go of. Kira gently placed her black coffee mug down onto a leather coaster, taking her time. Her face remained a perfect, unreadable mask of cold detachment throughout the entire outburst. She did not raise her voice. She did not argue, and she made no attempt whatsoever to defend herself against the wild, sweeping accusations being hurled at her. Instead, she calmly reached into the inner pocket of her custom-tailored jacket and pulled out a sleek silver remote control. She smoothly slid the small device across the polished mahogany surface, watching it glide effortlessly until it eventually came to a stop perfectly in the exact center of the vast table. Kira calmly pressed a single red button without any dramatic flourish. The motorized projector screen silently dropped down from the ceiling directly behind her. The glowing white light of the high-definition projector immediately washed over the darkened boardroom, casting long, sharp shadows across the polished mahogany table and every stunned face around it. Patricia abruptly stopped screaming mid-sentence. Her mouth snapped shut the instant the massive screen illuminated the space with cold, undeniable facts, staring back at all of them. Kira did not raise her voice to match her mother's frantic emotional hysteria, refusing entirely to engage in their familiar, exhausting theatrical battles that had defined so much of their relationship. She leaned back comfortably in her plush leather executive chair and casually gestured toward the brightly lit screen behind her. She had always preferred raw, verifiable data over desperate, unraveling lies. Displayed in stark, towering letters across the entire screen were the complete, unedited financial records of DeAndre and Brittany's joint savings account, laid bare for the whole room to see. Every deposit, every withdrawal, and every single wire transfer was listed there in excruciating, undeniable detail, impossible to dispute or explain away. DeAndre felt the air physically leave his lungs in a single involuntary breath. He walked slowly toward the front of the room, his eyes fixed firmly and helplessly on the horrifying numbers scrolling steadily down the massive display. The total balance sitting at the absolute bottom of the deeply red column simply read, 0, in stark, merciless clarity. Their entire future was gone, vanished completely. Patricia slammed her hands on the table again, desperately attempting to seize back control of the crumbling narrative before it slipped entirely out of her grasp. She aggressively pointed at the screen, shouting loudly that this was entirely fake, a fabrication designed to destroy them. She screamed that Kira had obviously used her tech company to illegally hack into their private banking system and steal the money herself, framing an innocent family for her own crime. She violently slammed her fists down again, harder this time. She loudly demanded that the city police be called to the executive suite immediately, insisting that Kira be arrested on the spot for felony cybercrime. Kira did not blink. She did not defend herself against the wild, escalating accusations being thrown her way. She simply reached forward and confidently tapped a single key on her sleek, highly advanced silver laptop. The projected image instantly shifted before everyone's eyes. The bank statements disappeared, replaced immediately by a forensic digital footprint analysis. Rows upon rows of glowing green code and IP addresses filled the entire screen from edge to edge. Kira finally spoke, breaking the heavy, suffocating silence with calm, lethal authority that carried through the room. She looked directly at her screaming mother and stated clearly, without a trace of hesitation, that she had not hacked their bank account. She calmly explained that a genuine bank hack leaves a very specific digital trail behind it, a forceful entry originating from an external, unrecognized server. She pointed a small laser at the screen, highlighting a recurring string of numbers for everyone to see clearly. She clinically explained, in the tone of someone stating a simple fact, that the money had not been stolen by any external threat at all. The massive withdrawals were entirely manual, deliberately authorized transactions. Kira tapped another key, bringing up the specific device registration logs onto the screen. She systematically broke down each piece of digital evidence for the now completely silent room, leaving no ambiguity. Every single unauthorized wire transfer had originated from one specific, highly recognizable IP address. The system had logged the exact MAC address of the device used to drain the joint savings account down to nothing. It was a brand new Apple smartphone. It was registered directly to Brittany. Brittany let out a sharp, uncontrollably panicked gasp that echoed loudly through the silent room. She took 2 quick steps backward, desperately trying to hide herself behind her mother's shoulder. She shook her head rapidly and repeatedly, her face pale with absolute terror, but she could not formulate a single coherent word in her own defense. Kira mercilessly continued her highly clinical, devastating presentation without showing even a single ounce of pity or hesitation. She highlighted the final destination of the missing funds, tracing every dollar with cold precision. The money had not gone toward a down payment on a luxury suburban home. The money had not gone toward paying off the crippling debts of a failed designer boutique. The money had been wired directly, repeatedly, and manually into a series of offshore, completely untraceable online casinos. Kira displayed the transaction logs, showing a relentless, obsessive pattern of behavior that had clearly gone on for a long time. Thousands of dollars vanished on a random Tuesday afternoon. Tens of thousands vanished on a quiet, unremarkable Thursday. Hundreds of thousands completely evaporated over the course of a single long weekend. The entire family watched the indisputable proof of a severe, uncontrollable gambling addiction broadcast across a 20-foot screen for all to witness. Kira stated flatly that Brittany had systematically gambled away every single cent of their shared future, and then maliciously blamed her own sister in order to hide her tracks and escape consequence. DeAndre did not look at his wife. He could not bring himself to look at the woman who had so effortlessly, so completely, destroyed their lives together. He simply stared blankly at the glowing screen instead. His eyes frantically scanned the exact timestamps of the massive offshore wire transfers, searching for some explanation that would never come. The specific dates jumped out at him one by one, burning themselves permanently into his memory. He meticulously read the glowing dates again and again, unable to fully process the depth of the betrayal unfolding in front of him. A sickening, suffocating realization washed over him all at once, turning his blood to ice in his veins. He remembered those specific, lonely nights with perfect, painful clarity. He had sat alone in their cramped apartment, proudly telling his friends all about his incredibly selfless, devoted wife. He recognized the exact same dates now glowing brightly on the enormous screen before him. They were the exact, identical nights Brittany had convincingly claimed she was working late at the city hospital, generously volunteering her time to help sick children in need. DeAndre slowly lowered his head, feeling the sickening weight of the truth crush the last remaining fragments of his blind, unwavering faith. Brittany did not hesitate for even a moment to activate her lifelong defense mechanism, the one she had relied on since childhood. She let out a piercing, theatrical wail that instantly shattered the heavy silence hanging over the massive boardroom. Tears immediately flooded her perfectly painted face, ruining her expensive cosmetics in streaks down her cheeks. She aggressively pointed a violently trembling finger at the glowing projector screen, her voice shaking with expertly manufactured outrage. She shrieked that the entire digital presentation was nothing but an elaborate, malicious forgery. She loudly insisted that Kira had deliberately altered the banking statements just to destroy her marriage out of spite. She sobbed violently, claiming that her younger sister had always been insanely jealous of her perfect, happy life and was now using her vast corporate wealth to frame her for a terrible financial crime she never actually committed. She took 2 desperate steps backward, throwing both her hands dramatically over her face, waiting for someone to rush to her rescue as they always had. Patricia did exactly what she had proudly done for the past 30 years without fail. She rushed forward and wrapped her arms tightly around her weeping, deceitful daughter. She pulled Brittany firmly against her chest, aggressively smoothing her blonde hair while shooting venomous glares across the entire room at anyone who dared look on. Patricia loudly shushed Brittany with confident reassurance, promising that no one was ever going to believe these vicious technological lies. She firmly patted her back, declaring loudly that her beautiful girl was nothing but a selfless angel who generously dedicated her life to helping sick children, not some degenerate gambler hiding secret offshore bank accounts from her family. Patricia then sharply turned her boiling wrath away from the undeniable digital evidence entirely and aimed it directly at the easiest, most convenient target left standing in the room. She locked her furious, judgmental eyes squarely on DeAndre. Patricia stepped away from Brittany just enough to point a sharply manicured finger at the stunned, silent man. She aggressively spat that this entire financial disaster was, in the end, ultimately his fault, and his alone. Her harsh voice dripped with undisguised contempt as she viciously dismantled his entire career and dignity in front of everyone present. She loudly proclaimed that he was a total pathetic failure of a provider for his family. She openly sneered at his respectable title as a dedicated high school principal, cruelly calling it nothing more than a glorified babysitting job that paid absolutely insulting pennies for his effort. She stepped much closer to him, her face twisting with bitter, elitist resentment that she no longer bothered to hide. She stated coldly that if DeAndre actually made a highly respectable salary like a real, capable man should, Brittany would never have to constantly stress over their limiting finances the way she had been forced to. She yelled that it was completely unnatural for a young woman of Brittany's high, distinguished pedigree to live in a cramped, miserable city apartment, constantly counting grocery coupons just to get by. Patricia's aggressive tone grew increasingly dark and heavily condescending with every passing second. She loudly implied that DeAndre was forcefully dragging her precious daughter down into the muddy gutter where he had originally come from, sparing no cruelty in her delivery. She deliberately used sharp, deeply coded language that instantly stripped away any remaining pretense of modern civility from the room. She explicitly stated that certain people from his specific urban background simply did not understand how to properly maintain a delicate woman of Brittany's superior caliber and standing. She shrieked that Brittany was practically starving for the lavish lifestyle she had rightfully been born into, and that DeAndre's pathetic inability to effortlessly provide it was the only true crime happening anywhere in that room. DeAndre stood perfectly still through all of it. The relentless barrage of insults washed over him, but surprisingly, they no longer stung his pride the way they once might have. Instead, they acted as a powerful, illuminating spotlight, showing him something he had refused to see for years. He looked closely at Patricia's sneering, arrogant face. He heard the unmistakable, ugly undertones woven through her aggressive rant. He saw, clearly and finally, the blatant toxic racism and deep-seated classism she had carefully hidden behind polite suburban smiles for years on end. He then slowly turned his gaze directly toward his weeping wife, searching her face for something, anything, that might redeem the moment. Brittany was not defending him. She was not stepping in to stop her mother's incredibly vicious, bigoted attack on her own husband. Brittany was simply nodding along quietly, hiding behind Patricia's shoulder, using her mother's vile prejudice as a convenient shield to escape accountability for her own massive financial crimes. DeAndre saw them both now with absolute, undeniable clarity. He saw the profound sickness rotting away at the very core of their family. They were not merely entitled people. They were fundamentally broken, manipulative, and deeply toxic to their core. DeAndre's expression hardened into solid granite before their eyes. The warm, supportive husband he had always been vanished completely, replaced instead by a man waking up abruptly from a terrible, prolonged nightmare. He did not yell back at the screaming woman in front of him. He did not defend his own highly honorable profession against her cruel mockery. He did not try to argue with the twisted logic of a prejudiced woman fiercely defending a thief. He simply looked down at his own left hand in silence. He reached over and tightly gripped the gold ring resting there. He slowly pulled it off his finger, feeling its familiar weight leave him for the last time. He walked silently over to where Kira sat and firmly placed the ring flat on the polished mahogany table in front of her. DeAndre turned his back on the polished mahogany table entirely and began walking steadily toward the heavy silver elevator doors at the far end of the room. The soft thud of his footsteps echoed like a final verdict through the massive glass boardroom. Brittany realized with sudden and total clarity the absolute finality of his silent gesture. Her carefully constructed facade of victimhood completely shattered in an instant. She let out a guttural, terrifying scream that tore through the pristine executive suite without warning. She lunged forward desperately, her expensive high heels slipping slightly against the imported white oak flooring beneath her. She desperately grabbed at the empty air where her husband had just been standing moments before. She shrieked his name over and over, her voice cracking under the severe strain of genuine, unrehearsed panic. Her luxurious lifestyle was walking straight out the door in front of her, and she knew with sudden dread that she had absolutely no way to survive without his steady, reliable income behind her. She violently clawed at her own blonde hair, dropping to her knees in a pathetic display of manufactured despair meant for an audience that no longer cared. She begged him to stop, promising desperately that she could explain the massive offshore transfers if he would only listen, swearing through her tears that she would attend rehabilitation immediately if he gave her the chance. She wailed loudly and desperately, seeking any shred of sympathy from the man she had methodically bankrupted over the past 2 years of their increasingly strained marriage. Patricia stared in absolute horror as her perfect family image disintegrated completely before her eyes. She fiercely grabbed her husband by the shoulder of his expensive cashmere coat. She violently shook Richard, shouting at him loudly, commanding him to physically intervene in the unfolding disaster. She ordered him to chase down DeAndre immediately, to physically drag him back into the boardroom, and to force him to honor his sacred marriage vows no matter what. She shrieked that no man simply abandons a beautiful woman from their prestigious bloodline, not without consequences. Richard did not move a single muscle in response. He completely ignored his frantic, screaming wife beside him. His eyes remained permanently glued to the glowing white projector screen across the room. The devastating reality of the digital forensic evidence had completely paralyzed him where he stood. He was a ruthless businessman who had built a manufacturing empire from absolutely nothing, and he understood raw numbers far better than he had ever understood human emotions. He mentally calculated the staggering sum his favorite daughter had willfully stolen and subsequently gambled away at sketchy foreign online casinos over the years. The offshore accounts, the specific IP addresses, and the undeniable timestamp logs matching her supposed charity nights all painted a crystal-clear picture of pure financial treason committed against her own family. His jaw hung slack as he finally realized that Brittany was not a victim in any sense of the word. She was a calculating parasite who had been feeding off them for years. Kira finally broke her stoic, seated posture at the head of the table. She slowly stood up from her plush leather executive chair, smoothing the front of her custom-tailored charcoal suit with a single practiced motion. She bypassed her hysterical mother and her paralyzed father with effortless, chilling grace, as though they were simply obstacles in her path. She walked with deliberate, powerful strides across the vast room, intercepting DeAndre just before he could press the glowing elevator call button. She reached into the interior breast pocket of her sharp jacket without hesitation. She smoothly pulled out a small, heavy silver flash drive. She held it out to him, her cold eyes locking onto his exhausted, hollowed-out face. She spoke with a quiet, lethal intensity that completely cut through Brittany's obnoxious wailing still echoing in the background. Kira stated clearly that the drive contained every single piece of forensic data that had just been displayed on the screen. She explicitly detailed that it held the exact routing numbers, the hidden offshore casino accounts, and the complete communication logs Brittany had desperately tried to delete before anyone could find them. She instructed DeAndre to hand the drive directly to the most ruthless divorce attorney he could find anywhere in the city. She firmly told him to use the undeniable digital evidence to utterly crush her sister in court without mercy. She commanded him to take full, permanent custody of the kids and never look back. DeAndre looked down at the cold silver device resting in his open palm. It was the ultimate weapon he needed to secure his permanent freedom and protect his children from their deceitful, dangerous mother. He tightly closed his fist around the drive, feeling the heavy weight of and stepped into the waiting elevator. The heavy silver doors silently slid shut behind him, permanently sealing his departure from that life. Brittany witnessed her entire future evaporate behind those closing metal doors. A primal, vicious rage entirely overtook her earlier panic in an instant. She scrambled up from the hardwood floor, her tear-streaked face twisting into a mask of pure hatred aimed squarely at her sister. She let out a feral shriek and aggressively lunged directly at Kira, her manicured hands raised like claws, desperately attempting to violently scratch her younger sister's calm, unbothered face. Kira did not even flinch or take a single step backward before Brittany could close the short distance between them. The two massive security personnel standing in tailored black suits exploded into motion instantly. They intercepted the furious woman with terrifying speed and absolute precision, closing the gap before she could reach her target. They tackled Brittany forcefully, driving her down and brutally pinning her flat against the hardwood floor beneath them. Patricia watched her favorite child hit the floor hard. The loud impact of Brittany against the pristine white oak instantly snapped Patricia out of her shocked paralysis and back into furious motion. She reached into her expensive leather handbag with trembling fingers, fumbling for a moment before finding what she needed. She yanked out her smartphone and frantically punched at the screen. She brought the device up to her ear, her face flushing with a terrifying, blindly vindictive rage that had fully consumed her. She was not going to let this humiliation stand, not for one more second. She loudly announced to the entire room that she was calling the authorities immediately. Richard stepped forward, his eyes wide with sudden, absolute panic at what she was doing. He reached out and forcefully grabbed his wife by the wrist. He desperately urged her to stop before it was too late. He pointed a shaking finger at the massive projector screen, still displaying the undeniable proof of Brittany and her offshore casino transfers for anyone to see. He hissed that bringing the police into this room would completely destroy them all. He warned Patricia that the digital footprint was undeniable and that the authorities would immediately arrest Brittany for massive financial fraud the moment they arrived. Patricia violently ripped her arm away from her husband's grip. She glared at Richard with open disgust, calling him a pathetic coward who refused to protect his own blood when it mattered most. The emergency dispatcher answered the call on the other end. Patricia instantly transformed her entire demeanor. The aggressive, screaming woman vanished in a heartbeat. She immediately adopted the desperate, shaking voice of a terrified victim instead. She began sobbing hysterically into the receiver. She cried that she was currently trapped inside a tall, massive corporate office building. She shrieked that her heavily armed captors were violently assaulting her innocent daughter right in front of her eyes. She begged the dispatcher to send help immediately, claiming they were being held completely against their will by a deranged, vindictive executive who had lost all control. She provided the exact address and the specific floor number without hesitation, pleading for heavily armed tactical units to rescue her family from what she described as imminent death. Kira watched the entire theatrical performance unfold with cold, unwavering detachment from where she stood. She did not attempt to stop the frantic phone call in progress. She did not try to reason with her hysterical mother mid-lie. She simply waited patiently for Patricia to finish giving the dispatcher every last detail about the building. Once the call finally disconnected, Kira offered a thin, utterly joyless smile that held no warmth at all. She looked down at her older sister, who was currently pressing her wet, ruined face against the expensive hardwood flooring in defeat. Kira issued a quiet, sharp command without raising her voice. She instructed her two massive security personnel to immediately release the struggling woman pinned beneath them. The guards instantly stepped back smoothly in unison, retreating into the shadows of the vast boardroom, their faces completely unreadable throughout. Brittany scrambled backward across the floor, frantically gasping for air and clutching at her own chest. She quickly crawled behind her mother once more, using Patricia as a physical shield against a threat that existed only in her own fabricated story. Kira reached out and pressed a glowing silver button on the sleek intercom console resting on her mahogany desk. She spoke in a perfectly level, professional tone that betrayed no emotion whatsoever. She instructed her executive assistant waiting in the outer lobby to remain on high alert for what was coming. She explicitly ordered the assistant to greet the Chicago police officers the absolute second they stepped through the main revolving doors downstairs. She commanded the assistant to personally escort the responding officers directly up the private express elevator and straight into the boardroom without any delay whatsoever. The room descended into a suffocating, incredibly tense silence that seemed to stretch on forever. Richard paced back and forth across the floor, rubbing his temples fully, finally understanding the catastrophic legal storm his wife had just unleashed upon their entire family. He knew the offshore wire transfers constituted severe felony fraud under any reasonable interpretation. He knew DeAndre now had the flash drive in his possession. He knew they possessed absolutely zero leverage left to negotiate with. Patricia stood tall despite it all, holding Brittany tightly against her, a look of smug, triumphant anticipation radiating from her powdered face. She truly believed her wealthy suburban status would automatically make the police side with her when they arrived. She fully expected to watch her disobedient younger daughter dragged out of the building in heavy steel handcuffs before the hour was through. 10 grueling minutes passed in absolute, agonizing quiet, each one stretching longer than the last. The heavy glass boardroom doors finally swung open with a loud, authoritative crash that echoed through the space. 4 uniformed Chicago police officers entered the room in swift, coordinated fashion. They stepped into the blinding white light cast by the modern projector screen, looking highly trained, completely serious, and fully prepared to neutralize any imminent physical threat they might encounter. Their hands rested cautiously near their duty belts as they moved. Their eyes rapidly scanned the massive executive suite, searching methodically for the violent hostage situation that had been reported over the emergency dispatch radio moments earlier. Patricia did not waste a single second once they arrived. She practically sprinted toward the arriving officers, completely ignoring their stern commands to remain perfectly still where she was. She aggressively thrust her manicured finger at Kira, who sat calmly at the head of the giant mahogany table without moving. Patricia screamed at the top of her lungs, demanding the officers arrest the woman in the charcoal suit immediately. She wildly accused Kira of orchestrating grand larceny, committing violent kidnapping, and executing massive corporate fraud all at once, piling accusation upon accusation without pause. She calmly looked down at her sister, who was still pinned firmly against the floor beneath the two guards. Kira issued a quiet, sharp command without raising her voice in the slightest. She instructed her highly trained personnel to immediately release the struggling woman they had subdued. The imposing guards instantly stepped back smoothly in unison, retreating into the shadows at the edges of the vast boardroom without a word. Brittany desperately scrambled backward across the polished white oak floor, frantically clutching her own chest and sobbing uncontrollably. She quickly crawled behind her mother once more, using Patricia as a physical shield against a threat that had never actually existed outside her own imagination. Kira casually reached forward and pressed a glowing button on the intercom console resting near her hand. She spoke in a perfectly level tone, instructing her assistant to personally escort the responding Chicago police officers directly up the private elevator the exact second they arrived at the lobby. The massive boardroom descended into a suffocating, tense silence as everyone waited for the authorities to appear. Richard paced back and forth across the floor, vigorously rubbing his sweating temples, fully understanding at last the catastrophic legal storm his vindictive wife had just unleashed upon their entire family. He knew the massive offshore wire transfers constituted severe, undeniable felony fraud under any scrutiny. He knew they possessed absolutely zero leverage left in this deteriorating situation. Patricia, however, stood incredibly tall despite it all, holding her weeping daughter tightly against her chest. A look of smug, triumphant anticipation radiated steadily from her powdered face. She truly believed her wealthy suburban status and distinguished family pedigree would force the responding police to side with her once they understood who she was. She fully expected to watch her tyrannical younger daughter be brutally dragged out of the building in heavy steel handcuffs before the hour was over. Exactly 10 grueling minutes passed in agonizing quiet before the heavy glass doors finally swung open with a loud, echoing crash. 4 uniformed officers aggressively entered the room in tight formation. They stepped into the blinding light cast by the modern projector screen, looking highly trained, completely serious, and fully prepared to neutralize any imminent physical threat they might encounter inside. Their hands rested cautiously near their duty belts as their eyes rapidly scanned the executive suite, searching methodically for the violent hostage situation that had supposedly been reported over dispatch. Patricia did not hesitate for even a second. She sprinted toward the arriving officers, completely ignoring their stern commands to remain still where she stood. She thrust her finger directly at Kira, loudly demanding the officers arrest the woman immediately. Patricia shrieked that Kira was guilty of grand larceny, kidnapping, and corporate fraud, piling accusation upon accusation without a single pause for breath. The lead officer demanded a clear explanation before proceeding any further. Kira maintained her straight, composed posture and calmly reached for her briefcase resting beside the chair. She withdrew a heavy manila folder bearing official state seals across its cover. She handed the file directly to the lead officer without a word of protest or hesitation. She explained clearly that the first section contained the notarized foreclosure deeds on her parents' estate, proving conclusively that they had lost their home due to their own defaulted loans and nothing else. She pointed calmly to the second section, which held a lawful eviction notice signed personally by a presiding county judge. She then handed the officer a smartphone displaying security footage recorded only 5 minutes earlier. The video clearly showed Brittany's vicious lunge across the room, and Patricia dialing the phone to spin her malicious, fabricated lies to the dispatcher. The officer thoroughly reviewed every piece of evidence in silence. He lowered the phone slowly, his protective, cautious demeanor completely vanishing in an instant. His expression hardened into solid granite as the picture became clear. He looked directly into Patricia's panicked face and delivered a devastating, matter-of-fact reality check. Ma'am, filing a false police report is a Class 4 felony. I suggest you leave this building before I arrest you myself. Patricia's mouth clamped shut instantly. The sheer, unyielding authority carried in the officer's voice instantly drained every last trace of color from her heavily powdered face. She slowly lowered her shaking, trembling hand, stepping back from Kira as the terrifying reality of the felony threat finally settled deep into her bones. The lead officer gestured sharply toward the heavy glass doors, instructing his team to clear the entire room immediately without further delay. He firmly ordered the family to gather their belongings and vacate the premises under full police escort. Richard did not utter a single word of protest through any of it. He mechanically grabbed his cashmere overcoat from the back of the leather chair and moved toward the exit with the defeated, hollow shuffle of a completely broken man. Brittany attempted one final desperate sob, looking toward the officers in a last bid for sympathy, but the uniformed men simply flanked her on either side, their hands still hovering near their belts. They marched the disgraced trio out of the executive suite, down the private elevator, and straight through the sprawling marble lobby below. Whispers and pointed stares followed them the entire way, as Kira's own sleek corporate employees quietly watched the highly public expulsion unfold in real time. The heavy revolving doors deposited them onto the unforgiving concrete of the Chicago sidewalk outside. The brutal, freezing winter wind immediately sliced straight through their expensive designer clothing without mercy. They stood there shivering next to their hastily packed luxury suitcases, completely stripped now of their wealth, their dignity, and their power all at once. The wailing sirens of distant traffic echoed faintly through the freezing urban canyon around them. Patricia wrapped her arms tightly around herself, her teeth visibly chattering as she glared bitterly up at the towering glass skyscraper they had just been ejected from. She angrily turned toward her husband, opening her mouth to launch into a vicious tirade about suing the entire police department for their treatment. Richard did not let her get a single word out. A massive, unprecedented wave of boiling rage violently erupted from somewhere deep in his chest. He aggressively threw his leather briefcase down onto the freezing concrete without warning. He turned on Patricia, his face twisting into an ugly mask of pure, long-suppressed resentment finally breaking free. He loudly screamed that this entire catastrophic disaster was entirely, completely, her fault, and no one else's. He viciously blamed her for spending 30 straight years mindlessly spoiling Brittany, intentionally enabling every single reckless mistake their eldest daughter had ever made along the way. He wildly gestured toward Brittany, who stood shivering and crying beside a street lamp a few feet away. Richard roared that Patricia had single-handedly created a greedy, incompetent monster with her own 2 hands. His loud voice echoed down the busy city block as he brutally dismantled his wife's entire approach to parenting in front of strangers. He yelled that she had deliberately alienated Kira for years, maliciously pushing away the only genuinely capable, truly successful child they had ever raised, just to coddle a pathetic thief instead. He spat that Patricia's blind, toxic favoritism had successfully bankrupted his lifelong corporate empire in the process. Brittany gasped loudly at the outburst, pressing her freezing hands against her tear-stained cheeks in disbelief. She aggressively stomped her expensive high heel onto the icy pavement, completely oblivious to the absolute magnitude of their financial ruin surrounding them. She loudly shrieked that she was freezing to death and demanded that Richard immediately stop yelling at once. She aggressively commanded her father to pull out his phone right then and book them an executive suite at the Waldorf Historic down the street without further delay. She wailed that she urgently needed a hot bath, a stiff drink, and premium room service to recover from the massive emotional trauma Kira had just inflicted upon her. She arrogantly crossed her arms over her chest, waiting impatiently for her father to quickly obey her strict, unreasonable orders. Richard stared at his eldest daughter with absolute, unfiltered disgust. He slowly reached into his tailored slacks and pulled out his smartphone with a trembling hand. He opened his banking application, his shaking fingers tapping repeatedly against the frozen glass screen. He let out a harsh, dry, terrifying laugh that sounded far more like a death rattle than genuine amusement. He aggressively shoved the glowing screen directly into Brittany's startled face. He loudly announced that his platinum credit cards were completely declined, every single one of them. He screamed that Kira had already legally frozen every corporate account, every personal checking fund, and every emergency line of credit associated with the family name entirely. They had absolutely nothing left to their name. Patricia let out a horrified, guttural gasp, her legs giving out slightly beneath her as she slumped weakly against the cold metal of a nearby trash receptacle. She stared blankly out at the busy street, slowly realizing that they were essentially homeless now, standing on a freezing sidewalk with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a few suitcases of luggage. Suddenly, a bright, blinding white light flashed sharply from the dark corner of an adjacent alleyway nearby. Another rapid succession of intense flashes quickly followed, temporarily blinding the entire shivering family where they stood. A scruffy paparazzi photographer, clearly tipped off in advance by a highly connected anonymous inside source, stepped directly into their personal space without asking permission. He held a massive professional camera, rapidly snapping sharp, high-resolution photographs of their spectacular public downfall. He aggressively circled the weeping, shivering trio, capturing every miserable angle of the formerly elite, untouchable family, now standing completely destitute on the dirty city curb for all to see. The harsh, relentless camera flashes mercilessly illuminated their total, absolute ruin as they all desperately wept in the cold. Exactly 7 days passed since that humiliating spectacle out on the freezing Chicago pavement. Patricia refused, completely and stubbornly, to accept her monumental defeat. The sprawling suburban mansion was gone for good. The prestigious country club memberships had all been revoked without exception. The infinite credit lines had been permanently severed one by one. She currently sat on a lumpy beige sofa inside a cramped, dirty motel room located on the gritty outskirts of the city, far from anything resembling her old life. Richard sat silently at a sticky laminate table nearby, staring blankly at the stained wallpaper, completely broken by his spectacular financial ruin. Brittany occupied the sagging motel bed, mindlessly scrolling through her phone for hours, aggressively ignoring the mounting pile of unpaid legal notices stacked beside her. Patricia glared at the flickering television screen across the room, her mind actively churning with pure, undiluted venom. She was not going to let Kira walk away completely victorious from all of this. If Patricia was going down, she was fully determined to drag her ungrateful, tyrannical daughter down into the muddy gutter right along with her. She reached into her massive leather handbag and pulled out her smartphone once more. She quickly accessed her contacts and dialed a specific number she had secretly saved away for absolute emergencies, just like this one. The man on the other end of the line was a notoriously sleazy tabloid journalist, well known for publishing highly destructive hit pieces on demand. Patricia arranged a covert meeting at a dingy diner just down the street from the motel. She sat across a sticky booth from the eager reporter, spinning a masterful, deeply calculated web of absolute fiction for his benefit. She cried perfectly timed, theatrical tears on command. She completely omitted the massive offshore gambling debts, the forged signatures, and the undeniable corporate fraud from her account entirely. Instead, she painted a heartbreaking portrait of a devoted elderly mother brutally betrayed by a ruthless, power-hungry corporate monster masquerading as her own daughter. She falsely claimed that Kira had manipulated Richard into signing away his life rights during a period of severe medical vulnerability that never actually occurred. She dramatically insisted that her own daughter had ruthlessly evicted them from their lifelong family home right before the holiday season, timing it for maximum cruelty. She handed the eager journalist a carefully curated stack of old, misleading family photographs, deliberately designed to maximize public sympathy for her cause. The reporter eagerly scribbled down every single toxic lie she offered, smelling a viral sensation in the making. The explosive article launched online early Tuesday morning without warning. The aggressive headline dominated local news feeds within hours. It read, in bold black letters, that a prominent tech executive had aggressively evicted her elderly parents and rendered them completely homeless overnight. The article rapidly circulated across every major social media platform in the region. The hit piece brilliantly twisted every single fact it touched. It described Kira as a cold, calculating sociopath who had systematically destroyed her own flesh and blood out of pure, unadulterated greed. It featured a heavily edited, highly unflattering photograph of Kira leaving a corporate gala, juxtaposed directly against a tragic staged image of Patricia wiping away manufactured tears for the camera. The comment section beneath the article instantly ignited with vicious public outrage. Thousands of angry strangers relentlessly attacked Kira online, demanding she face severe professional consequences for her alleged elder abuse. The fabricated story was, in every sense, an absolute masterpiece of character assassination. Patricia sat in her miserable motel room, aggressively refreshing the rising page views again and again, a dark, vindictive smile finally stretching across her powdered face for the first time in a week. High above the bustling city streets, Kira sat behind her polished mahogany desk inside her pristine executive suite, entirely unbothered. She held her sleek tablet in one hand, calmly scrolling through the vile viral article without any visible reaction. She did not display a single ounce of panic or concern. Her sharp eyes scanned the ridiculous fabrications and the hysterical quotes directly attributed to her mother throughout the piece. She recognized Patricia's toxic playbook instantly, having seen it deployed before. It was the exact same manipulative strategy her mother had utilized for 3 full decades to isolate and control her. Kira knew the public outrage was completely artificial, built entirely on a fragile foundation of provable lies that would not survive scrutiny. She slowly set the tablet face down on her immaculate glass desk. She intertwined her fingers calmly, her expression hardening into a mask of pure, absolute resolve. She possessed the certified forensic flash drive. She held the notarized eviction documents in her files. She had the Chicago Police Department records confirming her mother's desperate attempt to file a false felony report just days earlier. Kira was fully prepared to utterly dismantle Patricia's pathetic smear campaign with surgical, indisputable facts of her own. The heavy glass door to her office suddenly swung open without a knock. Her executive assistant rushed into the room, abandoning her usual calm, professional demeanor entirely. The assistant clutched a glowing tablet tightly against her chest, her face completely pale with genuine, immediate panic. She practically sprinted across the thick carpet, stopping abruptly in front of the massive mahogany desk. Her voice shook with fear as she delivered the devastating update. She announced that the chief executive officer of their largest international client had just read the hit piece himself. The assistant took a sharp, terrified breath before continuing. She stated that the influential client was demanding an immediate virtual meeting regarding the bad press circulating online. She whispered that they were threatening to pull their massive account entirely if the terrible rumors were somehow verified. Kira did not blink at the news. She calmly instructed her terrified assistant to immediately transfer the incoming video call to the massive digital display dominating the far wall of her office. The sleek screen flickered to life a moment later, revealing the stern, deeply flushed face of Marcus Vance, staring back at her. Marcus was the billionaire chief executive officer of Apex Global, Kira's most lucrative and vital corporate client by a wide margin. He did not bother with simple pleasantries or basic formal introductions of any kind. He aggressively slammed a printed copy of the viral tabloid article onto his expansive mahogany desk for her to see. He loudly declared that Apex Global maintained a strict, zero-tolerance morality clause written into all of their vendor contracts. He viciously stated that his international conglomerate could not afford to be publicly associated with a ruthless corporate monster who had violently evicted her own elderly parents onto the freezing Chicago streets right before the holidays. He aggressively threatened to terminate their massive cybersecurity agreement immediately, unless Kira could somehow prove the disturbing allegations were completely fabricated from start to finish. Kira remained entirely unfazed throughout his tirade. She leaned back comfortably in her leather chair, intertwining her fingers calmly in her lap. She did not beg for his patience or offer any frantic apology whatsoever. She simply stared directly through the camera, deliberately, letting a heavy, suffocating silence stretch endlessly between them across the connection. She knew from long experience that the person who panicked first always lost the negotiation. When Marcus finally shifted uncomfortably in his seat, Kira launched her counteroffensive in a perfectly level, unhurried tone. She told Marcus plainly that business was driven by verifiable data, not sensationalized tabloid gossip manufactured by bitter, bankrupt relatives with an axe to grind. She smoothly pivoted the entire conversation, reminding the angry executive exactly why he had hired her firm in the first place all those years ago. She pointed out that her elite security protocols had successfully thwarted 3 major cyber attacks against Apex Global in the past fiscal quarter alone, saving him millions. She boldly stated that severing their contract over a fake news story would leave his entire global network incredibly vulnerable to devastating breaches going forward. Marcus opened his mouth to argue back, but Kira immediately cut him off before he could speak. She did not give him a single second to regain control of the conversation from her. She presented a sharp, unprecedented counteroffer designed specifically to exploit his ruthless business instincts. She confidently offered to personally provide Apex Global with 3 full months of her firm's most advanced, premium cybersecurity services, completely free of any charge whatsoever. She calmly explained that this generous concession would save his corporation millions of dollars in operational costs over that period. However, her unprecedented offer came attached to one strict, unnegotiable condition. She demanded exactly 48 hours to systematically and publicly destroy the false narrative currently surrounding her family. She looked directly into the camera lens, her eyes burning with fierce, unwavering determination. She promised Marcus that if she failed to completely clear her name and restore her impeccable public reputation within that narrow time frame, he could legally walk away from their contract entirely and still keep the 3 months of free security upgrades regardless. She challenged him, quite plainly, to recognize an unbeatable business deal when he saw one in front of him. Marcus stared at the digital screen in absolute, stunned silence for a long moment. He was a ruthless corporate shark himself, and he instantly recognized the incredible financial value hidden inside her bold proposition. He rapidly calculated the massive millions his company stood to save by accepting her temporary free services. He also recognized the sheer, terrifying confidence radiating steadily from Kira throughout the entire call. A woman facing legitimate criminal exposure would never wager millions of dollars on a public defense of her own name. She was not acting like a guilty daughter caught red-handed in a shameful scandal. She was acting, instead, like an apex predator momentarily cornered by insignificant prey that posed no real threat. He slowly leaned forward toward his own camera, a grim, calculated smile of absolute respect finally replacing his previously angry scowl. He firmly agreed to her strict terms without further debate. He sternly warned her that the clock was officially ticking now, and abruptly ended the virtual transmission between them. The massive wall screen instantly faded to black, plunging the executive office back into quiet, settled stillness. Kira remained seated in the quiet darkness for a brief moment afterward, savoring the lingering adrenaline of a successful negotiation well executed. She then turned her chair slowly to face her assistant, who was still standing completely frozen near the glass doorway, waiting for instructions. A cold, incredibly sharp, and terrifyingly confident smile slowly spread across Kira's pale, composed face. She quickly issued a rapid, undeniable series of commands one after another. She firmly instructed her highly efficient assistant to immediately contact the city convention center down the street without delay. She explicitly ordered her to rent the grand ballroom for the following evening, regardless of the exorbitant emergency booking fees involved. She then commanded the assistant to draft an urgent press release and blindly invite every major local news outlet, independent journalist, and tabloid photographer in the greater Chicago metropolitan area to attend. She confidently stood up from her desk, her eyes locked onto the glowing skyline visible outside her window. She announced that she was throwing a highly public, undeniably explosive press conference to finally put an absolute end to her mother's desperate lies once and for all. Kira wasted no time executing her brilliant masterstroke once the plan was set. She expertly instructed her public relations team to draft a highly specific, legally binding document cleverly disguised as an olive branch extended in good faith. She did not send a quiet, private email or a discreet text message to her family. She issued a formal, incredibly public invitation directly to Patricia, Richard, and Brittany, all at once. She simultaneously released this exact same document to every major news outlet across the city without exception. The elegant, gold-lettered digital invitation requested the honor of their presence at the downtown convention center for the following evening. Kira deliberately titled the event a public reconciliation and financial settlement, knowing exactly how that phrase would land. She knew her family possessed an absolute fatal weakness for public spectacle and raw financial greed above all else. She strategically worded the press release to imply a massive surrender on her part. She heavily suggested that the intense media pressure had successfully forced her to the negotiating table against her will. The invitation explicitly promised a comprehensive redistribution of family assets to be announced in front of a live global audience watching. Across town, inside the incredibly damp, mildewed walls of their cheap motel room, Patricia's smartphone violently buzzed with a premium news alert. She snatched the device off the sticky laminate table without hesitation. Her bloodshot eyes widened in absolute shock as she read the breaking headline announcing Kira's upcoming press conference. She quickly opened her personal email and found the glittering digital invitation already waiting patiently in her inbox. A loud, triumphant shriek erupted from deep within her lungs, instantly waking Brittany from a deep sleep on the sagging mattress beside her. Patricia aggressively shoved the glowing screen into her daughter's startled face. She wildly jumped up and down where she stood, her powdered face stretching into a massive, predatory grin of pure delight. She loudly declared that they had finally won the entire war. She gleefully shouted that the tabloid hit piece had completely destroyed Kira's corporate leverage once and for all. Richard rushed out of the cramped bathroom nearby, demanding to know what all the screaming was about. Patricia smugly read the entire invitation aloud to him, heavily emphasizing the words, "financial settlement," with obvious relish. She arrogantly strutted across the filthy carpet, completely forgetting for a moment their current homeless status. She confidently assured her husband and daughter that Kira was, at long last, begging for mercy. Patricia theorized aloud that Apex Global and the other massive corporate clients had threatened to pull their lucrative contracts entirely. She deduced that Kira had no choice left but to surrender the entire estate and reinstate their platinum credit lines in order to save her precious firm from ruin. Brittany instantly squealed with pure, unadulterated delight at the news. She aggressively threw her cheap motel blankets aside and began wildly clapping her manicured hands together. She loudly demanded they immediately begin preparing for their glorious, triumphant return to elite high society. She stubbornly insisted they urgently needed to look like absolute royalty when they graciously accepted Kira's pathetic, groveling apology on live national television. Patricia entirely agreed with her incredibly spoiled, entitled daughter without a moment's hesitation. She fiercely turned to Richard and demanded he hand over his emergency cash reserves at once. Richard hesitated nervously, rubbing the back of his neck with visible discomfort. He quietly admitted he only possessed a few $1,000s hidden inside a secret money clip tucked into his luggage. He warned his wife that this tiny stack of $100 bills was literally their last remaining lifeline in the world. They needed that cash simply for food and basic survival, he pleaded. Patricia aggressively snatched the money clip straight out of his trembling hands without another word. She viciously mocked his cowardice in front of Brittany. She loudly declared that they were about to become multimillionaires again by tomorrow evening regardless. She dragged Brittany out the motel door behind her, clutching the stolen cash tightly. They aggressively marched directly into the most expensive, exclusive luxury boutiques located along the world-famous Magnificent Mile downtown. They carelessly blew every single remaining dollar on custom-tailored silk suits, imported leather shoes, and fresh salon blowouts for the big evening ahead. They intentionally dressed themselves to project absolute ultimate power, completely ignoring the terrifying, undeniable reality that their bank accounts were completely, hopelessly overdrawn beneath the surface. While her ignorant family foolishly squandered their literal last dime on sheer vanity, Kira stood silently inside the grand ballroom of the city convention center across town. She watched dozens of busy technicians rapidly setting up heavy television cameras, bright studio lights, and a massive podium at the front of the room. Her phone vibrated inside her tailored jacket pocket. She pulled it out and saw a secure text message waiting from DeAndre. The loyal accountant had been quietly monitoring the family's social media activity in the background all week. DeAndre warned Kira that Brittany was currently broadcasting live from a luxury fitting room downtown. He stated that the spoiled girl was loudly bragging to thousands of loyal followers about getting the family mansion back the very next day. He warned Kira that her sister sounded dangerously, almost recklessly confident. Kira did not feel a single ounce of fear or hesitation reading it. She stared at the illuminated screen, taking in the frantic warning about her family's supreme arrogance without concern. She calmly typed her response a moment later. She did not write a long, detailed explanation or offer any complex strategic reassurance in return. She simply sent DeAndre a single thumbs-up emoji and nothing more. The inescapable trap was perfectly primed and ready to spring. The massive, heavy double doors of the downtown convention center swung open the following evening to admit a veritable tidal wave of reporters, corporate executives, and curious onlookers all at once. The sprawling, opulent grand ballroom was utterly transformed into a high-stakes media circus within hours. Rows of heavy television cameras formed a solid steel barricade at the back of the room. Brilliant white studio lights illuminated the space with a blinding clinical intensity that left no shadow untouched. Reporters shouted over one another constantly, aggressively jostling for the best possible vantage point near the stage. Business associates from Apex Global and several other major tech firms stood grouped near the velvet ropes, their expressions carefully guarded and unreadable. They were all waiting to see whether the infamous corporate shark was actually going to publicly surrender to a tabloid scandal after all. The ambient noise was a deafening, continuous roar of unyielding public speculation and frantic corporate whispers layered on top of each other. Right squarely in the middle of this absolute chaos, Patricia, Richard, and Brittany confidently made their loud, triumphant entrance into the room. They aggressively marched down the center aisle, looking every bit like royalty returning triumphantly from exile. Patricia wore a brand-new, custom-tailored emerald silk suit that shimmered brilliantly under the harsh studio lights above. She waved gracefully toward the flashing cameras, projecting the perfect image of a heartbroken but forgiving matriarch for the watching public. She stopped frequently along the way to offer completely fabricated, tearful quotes to eager journalists about the enduring power of blood and family bonds. Richard trailed slightly behind her the whole way, his expensive imported leather shoes squeaking softly against the polished floor with each step. He repeatedly dabbed nervous sweat from his forehead, his eyes darting frantically around the massive, unfamiliar crowd surrounding them. Brittany strutted alongside them both, holding her smartphone high in the air the entire time. She was broadcasting a live video stream to her followers as they walked, loudly narrating their imminent financial victory and boasting endlessly about her brand new designer wardrobe. They confidently bypassed the velvet ropes without a second glance and aggressively claimed the reserved plush seating directly in the front row, as though it had always belonged to them. Patricia crossed her legs elegantly, folded her manicured hands neatly in her lap, and offered the surrounding cameras a smug, deeply victorious smile. She was absolutely certain she was about to rightfully inherit an incredibly vast empire before the night was through. Marcus Vance stood quietly off to the side in the VIP viewing area, his sharp eyes focused intently on the empty stage ahead. The powerful chief executive officer of Apex Global had personally attended to witness this unprecedented, highly anticipated spectacle unfold in person. He watched Patricia playing the victim for the assembled press, then shifted his gaze calmly back toward the podium waiting at center stage. He knew a calculated corporate execution when he saw one being carefully prepared in front of him. The heavy tension inside the massive ballroom continued to build, thick enough now to suffocate the entire gathered crowd waiting in anticipation. The glowing digital clock mounted on the back wall flashed to the designated hour at last. A sharp, authoritative hum echoed suddenly from the primary sound system throughout the room. The deafening roar of the crowd instantly dropped to a low, electric murmur of anticipation. The heavy black curtains at the side of the stage smoothly parted a moment later. Kira walked into the blinding spotlight without hesitation. She did not look like a defeated, humiliated daughter begging for public forgiveness in any way. She looked utterly stunning, terrifyingly powerful, and completely in control of her domain from the first step. She wore a razor-sharp, pitch-black executive suit that fit her like literal armor across every seam. Her posture was perfectly rigid throughout. Her chin was held high, and her expression was a mask of pure, unyielding ice that gave nothing away. The blinding flashes of 100 cameras illuminated her path across the stage, but she did not blink or even flinch once. The heavy electric murmur of the massive crowd rapidly dissolved into absolute stunned silence as she commanded the entire room with her sheer physical presence alone. She confidently climbed the short steps up to the raised platform and walked directly to the exact center of the stage, without pause. Kira stepped up to the microphone waiting there. She slowly placed a single thin leather folder onto the wooden podium in front of her. She did not immediately speak. She deliberately let the heavy, suffocating silence stretch across the enormous ballroom, allowing the sheer weight of her authority to press down steadily on every single person in attendance. The room went completely dead silent within moments. You could have heard a pin drop against the carpet. Every camera lens in the room was locked onto her face. Every single reporter present held their collective breath, waiting. Kira slowly lifted her head at last. She ignored the sea of eager journalists and the powerful corporate executives watching intently from the wings. She looked directly down into the front row instead. She locked her sharp, unforgiving eyes entirely onto her mother's face. Patricia's smug, triumphant smile began to visibly falter under the freezing weight of that stare, cracking at the edges. Kira leaned smoothly into the microphone before her. Her calm voice echoed loudly through the cavernous space, sharp and ringing with absolute finality. Today I promised a financial settlement, but first, we must settle the truth. The heavy lights in the grand ballroom instantly went pitch dark without warning. A chorus of confused gasps rippled through the suffocating blackness that followed. The gathered corporate executives muttered nervously among themselves, while the frantic shifting of camera equipment echoed loudly across the carpeted floor around them. Patricia let out an offended squawk from the front row, demanding loudly that the staff restore the power immediately so she could claim her rightful inheritance without further delay. She assumed, wrongly, that this was nothing more than a pathetic technical failure interrupting her moment of triumph. She was entirely wrong. A massive cinematic digital display instantly ignited behind Kira, casting a harsh, pale blue glow over the completely stunned audience. The screen did not display a formal apology letter. It did not show a legally binding transfer of corporate assets. It projected crisp, brilliantly clear, high-definition security footage. The timestamp glowing in the top corner indicated the video had been recorded just 3 weeks prior, at a notoriously discreet, highly exclusive offshore casino tucked away in the Cayman Islands. The incredibly sharp video fed directly into the ballroom's primary audio system, blasting crystal-clear sound through the massive overhead speakers. The entire room watched in horror as a vivid image of Brittany materialized on the towering screen. She was not acting like a traumatized victim of corporate greed. She was dressed in a shimmering, diamond-encrusted cocktail dress, leaning aggressively over a high-stakes baccarat table. The camera angle captured her face as she casually tossed stacks of $100,000 chips toward the dealer. The audio picked up her shrill, arrogant laughter. She bragged to a nearby waitress about draining her sister's corporate accounts to fund her weekend getaway. The footage clearly showed Brittany eagerly cashing out illicitly obtained funds, linking her directly to the staggering offshore gambling debts that Patricia had falsely, shamelessly blamed on Kira. A collective gasp erupted from the hundreds of journalists packing the room. Pens flew across notepads. Microphones were shoved forward. Kira did not give the crowd a single moment to recover from the initial shock. She calmly raised her right hand, holding a small, sleek black presentation remote. She pressed a single button. The massive digital screen behind her instantly split down the middle. The offshore casino footage continued looping on the left side. On the right side, a series of incredibly detailed, highly confidential banking records and forged tax documents rapidly populated the display. Kira smoothly stepped back up to the microphone, her voice slicing through the rising chaos with surgical precision. She firmly directed the audience's attention to the right side of the split screen. She meticulously explained that the documents displayed were the internal ledgers for Brittany's highly publicized, supposedly philanthropic community fundraisers. For the past 3 years, Brittany had hosted lavish charity galas, allegedly raising millions for local children's hospitals and struggling community programs. The audience watched the screen in mounting disgust as Kira's presentation perfectly highlighted the damning digital paper trail. Glowing red arrows tracked every single donated dollar. The money did not go to sick children or community outreach. It funneled directly through a complex web of fake shell companies, straight into Brittany's personal offshore accounts. The undeniable forensic evidence proved that Brittany had systematically stolen millions from desperate charities to blindly fuel her lavish lifestyle and cover her disastrous gambling losses. The visual juxtaposition was absolutely devastating. On the left, Brittany was laughing and tossing stolen casino chips. On the right, the forged documents proved she had stolen that exact money from dying children. The ballroom instantly exploded into pure, unadulterated madness. Dozens of reporters frantically surged forward against the velvet ropes, screaming rapid-fire questions at the stage. The blinding white flashes of professional cameras erupted like a localized lightning storm, relentlessly illuminating the front row. The media realized they were not covering a boring corporate settlement. They were witnessing the live, brutal exposure of a massive federal charity fraud. Down in the front row, the carefully constructed facade of the Wilson family completely disintegrated. Brittany shrieked in absolute terror. She wildly threw her brand-new, custom-tailored silk jacket over her head, desperately trying to shield her face from the relentless flashing camera lenses. She violently shoved her chair back, searching for an escape route, but the sheer wall of hungry journalists blocked every possible exit. Patricia leaped to her feet, her face turning a dangerous mottled shade of crimson. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger at the stage, screaming hysterically at the top of her lungs. She viciously demanded that the invisible technicians immediately cut the power. She wildly threatened to sue everyone in the building, her voice cracking with pure, desperate panic. Richard slumped down in his seat, hiding his face in his hands, completely broken by the inescapable public humiliation. Kira ignored her mother's frantic screaming. She simply stared down at her utterly ruined family, raised her sleek black remote, and calmly clicked to the next slide. The massive screen instantly refreshed, replacing Brittany's offshore casino escapades with a dense, highly complex spreadsheet. The brilliant blue backlight washed over the audience as a series of heavily redacted federal tax documents suddenly appeared. The bold, unmissable header emblazoned across the top of the digital display named Richard's pristine real estate development firm. Red circles and stark yellow highlighting began to systematically illuminate specific discrepancies scattered throughout the intricate ledgers. The crowd leaned forward in absolute fascination as the undeniable forensic accounting laid bare a decade of systematic corporate fraud. The glowing numbers proved that Richard had routinely inflated his operating costs while actively hiding millions of dollars in revenue inside offshore shell accounts. The collective gasp from the attending business journalists sucked the remaining oxygen right out of the grand ballroom. Several prominent investors and former business partners seated near the VIP section instantly pulled out their phones, frantically dialing their own private legal counsel. Kira stood perfectly still behind the heavy wooden podium. She watched the devastating realization wash over her father's sweating face. Richard gripped the arms of his velvet chair so tightly his knuckles turned completely white. His jaw dropped open, but he could not produce a single word to defend himself against the undeniable, deeply incriminating mathematical proof displayed right above his head. He had spent his entire career projecting the flawless image of a self-made, highly ethical corporate titan. Now he was publicly exposed as a desperate, pathetic embezzler who had actively defrauded the federal government just to maintain his wife's exorbitant country club memberships. Patricia frantically tugged at her husband's sleeve, aggressively demanding that he do something to stop this humiliating spectacle. She viciously hissed that Kira was ruining their impeccable social standing. Kira ignored the pathetic whispering in the front row. She smoothly adjusted the microphone stand and let her voice resonate through the massive speakers with cold, surgical precision. "My parents claimed I was a financial burden," she said. "Yet these documents show they used my social security number to open fraudulent credit lines when I was in college, deliberately destroying my credit score." The entire ballroom went completely dead silent at the horrific revelation. The journalists stopped shouting and frantically began typing every single word into their laptops. Kira did not break eye contact with her parents as she delivered the final fatal blow to their pristine public facade. She coldly detailed exactly how Patricia and Richard had methodically stolen her identity right after her freshman year at the university. She explained that while they were publicly complaining to their wealthy friends about the high cost of her education, they were secretly taking out massive, high-interest loans in her name. They had ruthlessly saddled their own teenage daughter with crippling debt, just to secretly fund Brittany's lavish European vacations and purchase luxury vehicles they could not actually afford. They had actively sabotaged Kira's financial future to desperately hide their own impending bankruptcy. The media frenzy instantly reignited with explosive, uncontrollable intensity. The blinding flashes of 100 professional cameras relentlessly bombarded the front row, capturing every single angle of the family's total downfall. The gathered reporters shouted aggressive, overlapping questions at Richard and Patricia, demanding to know if they were prepared to face federal identity theft charges. The brutal realization of their complete and utter destruction finally crashed down upon the once powerful couple. They were no longer the respected elite members of Chicago high society. They were exposed felons, caught dead to rights on live national television, completely cornered by their own discarded daughter. The digital evidence continued to aggressively scroll behind Kira, highlighting exactly how many forged signatures Patricia had personally authorized in order to steal from her own child. Richard suddenly gasped for air. His face turned an unhealthy, pallid shade of gray beneath the harsh studio lights. He violently clutched the left side of his chest, his expensive silk suit crumpling under his desperate, shaking fingers. He slumped heavily back against the velvet chair, his breathing turning into rapid, shallow wheezes as the sheer magnitude of his absolute legal exposure triggered a severe panic attack. Brittany ignored her struggling father, still hiding her face beneath her designer jacket, completely consumed by her own selfish humiliation. Patricia slowly turned her head away from the stage. She looked wildly around the packed convention center. Her wide, terrified eyes scanned the massive crowd, desperately searching for a single sympathetic face. Instead, she saw the chief executive of her favorite local charity staring at her in absolute disgust. She saw the president of her exclusive country club whispering furiously to a prominent judge. Patricia's manicured hands began to tremble violently. She realized with absolute terrifying certainty that every high society friend she had ever cultivated was currently watching her entire legacy burn to ash. The suffocating atmosphere of the grand ballroom was suddenly shattered by a loud, echoing crash. The heavy, gold-plated double doors at the very back of the convention center flew open with tremendous physical force. The frantic journalists instantly stopped their relentless shouting and spun around to face the sudden intrusion. 5 stern figures stepped through the threshold, their sharp silhouettes cutting directly through the bright glare of the television lights. 2 of them wore crisp, dark federal suits, their lapels flashing the unmistakable silver badges of the Internal Revenue Service. The other 3 were seasoned local detectives, their heavy-duty utility belts and hardened expressions broadcasting absolute, undeniable authority. They did not pause to answer the immediate barrage of loud questions from the bewildered news reporters. They marched forward in a tight, highly disciplined formation straight down the center aisle. The massive sea of aggressive media personnel scrambled desperately to clear a wide path, immediately sensing the terrifying, palpable shift in the room's energy. The heavy, rhythmic thud of the officers' leather boots striking the plush carpet perfectly synchronized with the rapid, continuous clicking of the camera shutters. The grand ballroom suddenly felt less like a corporate venue and exactly like a massive steel trap snapping entirely shut around the guilty. The sheer gravity of the moment weighed heavily on every single spectator present. Up on the brightly lit stage, Kira did not flinch or retreat. She simply watched the grim authorities approach her family with cold, deeply calculated satisfaction. She leaned smoothly into the microphone one last time, her voice echoing across the vast space with chilling, absolute finality. She firmly announced to the completely silenced room that the damning digital files they were currently viewing were not a sudden, spontaneous theatrical reveal. She calmly explained that she had personally submitted the entire, unredacted financial dossier directly to federal authorities exactly 48 hours earlier. Every single offshore bank ledger, every forged corporate tax return, and every damning piece of casino security footage had already been thoroughly reviewed and completely verified by elite federal prosecutors. Kira stated clearly that this lavish, highly publicized press conference was never meant to be a simple corporate negotiation or a pathetic, desperate family feud. It was a carefully orchestrated, meticulously planned execution of long overdue justice. She confidently told the massive crowd that the public spectacle was simply the most efficient, absolutely undeniable way to ensure complete public transparency. Her toxic family had used the eager media for decades to actively build their fake, pristine corporate empire. So she deliberately used that exact same media to permanently tear it all down. She wanted every single defrauded investor, every cheated charity donor, and every scammed business partner to witness the undeniable, brutal truth simultaneously. The silent, imposing detectives finally reached the velvet rope separating the VIP section. The hungry journalists pressed in tightly behind them, eagerly forming a suffocating, impenetrable ring of heavy cameras and extended microphones around the isolated front row. The blinding white light strobed relentlessly over the completely broken Wilson family. Richard was still gasping for air, clutching his chest in genuine, terrifying physical agony, but the determined federal agents bypassed him entirely. They also completely ignored Patricia, who was currently frozen in a pathetic state of absolute wide-eyed shock, her trembling manicured hands gripping the leather armrests of her chair like a drowning woman desperately clinging to a fragile wooden raft in a raging storm. The lead local detective, a remarkably tall man with a visibly scarred chin and freezing, unsympathetic eyes, stopped directly in front of Brittany. She was still cowering beneath her expensive, custom-tailored silk jacket, desperately trying to block out the harsh, inescapable reality of the glaring ballroom. The veteran detective reached down and firmly, aggressively ripped the designer jacket away from her trembling, shrinking frame. Brittany let out a pathetic, startled shriek, instinctively raising both of her shaking hands to cover her ruined, tear-stained face. The blinding camera flashes immediately illuminated her smeared, expensive makeup and her wide, utterly terrified eyes. The towering, unsmiling local detective did not offer a gentle explanation or a polite request. He simply looked down at the trembling, ruined woman who had arrogantly stolen millions of dollars from sick children just to recklessly fund her secret offshore gambling addiction. His deep voice cut through the ambient buzz of the cavernous ballroom like a sharpened steel blade. He loudly and firmly ordered Brittany to stand up immediately. The sheer, overwhelming authority vibrating in his harsh tone left absolutely no room for pathetic negotiation or elite family privilege. He stared directly into her wide, panicked, weeping eyes and bluntly instructed her to quickly place both of her shaking hands firmly behind her lower back. The cold, metallic click of the heavy steel handcuffs echoed loudly through the sudden, suffocating silence of the grand ballroom. The sound was incredibly sharp, cutting through the dense air like a perfectly aimed gunshot. Brittany jerked violently as the cold metal clamped tightly around her delicate, perfectly manicured wrists. The absolute, sheer physical reality of the terrifying arrest finally shattered her arrogant, long-standing illusion of invincibility. She twisted wildly against the towering detective's unyielding grip, her expensive silk dress tearing slightly at the shoulder seam. Pure, unfiltered terror distorted her perfectly made-up face. She thrashed backward, digging her designer heels into the thick carpet, but the seasoned detective simply locked his massive hand around her bicep, easily restraining her pathetic struggle. Brittany threw her head back and let out an agonizing, ear-piercing shriek that rattled the crystal chandeliers hanging high above the crowd. She screamed for her mother, her voice cracking with the desperate, high-pitched hysteria of a spoiled child who had suddenly realized her actions carried permanent, devastating consequences. She begged Patricia to make the scary men go away, sobbing hysterically as a second officer stepped forward to read her Miranda rights in a flat, uncaring monotone. Patricia watched her golden child being forcibly subdued by federal law enforcement. The absolute core of her carefully manufactured elite suburban reality cracked and collapsed. She stumbled forward, her knees suddenly buckling under the intense weight of her imminent ruin. The heavy crowd of aggressive reporters instinctively parted slightly, backing away from the raw, ugly display of a high society matriarch entirely losing her composure. Patricia scrambled frantically toward the raised platform, her imported leather shoes scraping harshly against the floor. She no longer cared about her ruined public image or the flashing cameras capturing her total humiliation. She violently threw herself forward, collapsing completely onto her knees right at the edge of the wooden stage. The severe physical impact deeply bruised her bare legs, but she did not even flinch. She was hyperventilating, her chest heaving heavily as she stared up at the daughter she had ruthlessly tortured, exploited, and discarded for over a decade. Kira looked down at the pathetic, weeping woman groveling at her expensive boots. Her face remained a perfect, unreadable mask of carved marble. Patricia reached up with trembling, desperate hands, her manicured fingers clawing frantically at the empty air. Patricia's shaking hands finally found purchase, aggressively closing around the crisp, dark fabric of Kira's tailored suit skirt. She gripped the hem with the terrifying, unyielding desperation of a woman clinging to the absolute edge of a sheer cliff. Hot, genuine tears finally streamed down Patricia's heavily powdered cheeks, entirely ruining her flawless, expensive makeup. This was not a calculated performance for the gathered press, nor a manipulative tactic to secure corporate sympathy. This was pure, unadulterated, desperate terror. She looked up into Kira's cold, unforgiving eyes and unleashed a pathetic, begging wail that silenced the entire ballroom. "Please, Kira," Patricia sobbed, her voice breaking violently as she tugged at the fabric. "You are my daughter. You are my own flesh and blood. You have all of the money now. You have everything you ever wanted. Please, just pay their bail. Pay absolutely whatever they want from you. Please, save your only sister. Please save us from this horrible nightmare." She buried her wet, tear-streaked face directly into the fabric of Kira's dark skirt, crying with loud, ugly, uncontrollable gasps. She was literally begging for financial salvation from the exact same child she had systematically tried to destroy. The massive grand ballroom went completely, unnervingly still. Every single person in the convention center stopped moving, stopped typing, and seemed to stop breathing altogether. The aggressive journalists lowered their flashing cameras, their eyes locked entirely on the incredible, raw drama unfolding on the stage. The federal agents paused their methodical documentation, watching the interaction with narrowed, highly observant eyes. The entire room collectively held its breath, captivated by the staggering, unprecedented shift in family power. The heavy, electric tension in the air was so thick it felt like physical pressure bearing down on every spectator's shoulders. They were all waiting to see exactly what the brilliant, notoriously ruthless corporate architect would do next. Would she finally break under the intense, crushing weight of a desperate mother's genuine, tearful plea? Would the ingrained, powerful biological instinct to protect her own family ultimately override her meticulously planned, totally devastating corporate revenge? Or would she simply stand there and watch the authorities drag her weeping mother and screaming sister away in cold, heavy steel chains? The absolute, overwhelming silence stretched into a long, incredibly grueling eternity. Kira slowly tilted her elegant head downward. She stared silently down at the sobbing, utterly broken woman desperately clutching her dark skirt, her sharp, beautiful face completely unreadable. Kira looked down at the kneeling figure of the woman who had intentionally made her existence a living nightmare for 3 decades. Patricia's desperate grip on the dark fabric of Kira's tailored skirt felt like the culmination of a lifetime of emotional extortion. For 30 years, this woman had systematically prioritized Brittany's shallow desires over Kira's fundamental well-being. She had weaponized a mother's love, turning basic parental affection into a toxic transactional currency that Kira could never quite earn, no matter how hard she tried or how much she achieved. Kira did not offer a victorious smile. She did not raise her voice to yell or gloat over the victory. The burning anger that had fueled her relentless corporate ascent had completely evaporated, leaving behind nothing but a freezing expanse of absolute indifference. The audience held its collective breath, the heavy silence amplifying the sound of Patricia's ugly, gasping sobs. The elite executives and journalists waited for the highly anticipated verbal execution, expecting the chief executive to unleash some kind of vengeful monologue. Instead, Kira allowed the crushing weight of the suffocating silence to press down heavily upon her kneeling mother. She let Patricia drown in the bitter reality of her own catastrophic choices. Every camera lens remained locked onto the stage, documenting the exact moment the generational power dynamic permanently shifted. Patricia begged again, her voice a broken rasp echoing across the grand ballroom. She pleaded for family loyalty, invoking the sacred bond of blood she herself had so ruthlessly violated time and time again. Kira remained entirely unmoved by the frantic, tearful display. She smoothly pulled the hem of her dark skirt out of Patricia's sweaty, desperate grip. The physical detachment was sharp and brutally final. Patricia's hands fell heavily onto the polished wooden floor of the stage, her fingers scraping uselessly against the hard surface. Kira took one measured step back, creating an unbridgeable physical and emotional chasm between them. The blinding studio lights illuminated her rigid posture and her completely unreadable expression. She leaned slightly toward the microphone, her voice slicing through the heavy air with the chilling precision of a freshly sharpened scalpel. "You told me not to leave my room until I apologized to my sister," Kira said, her tone flat and completely devoid of any human warmth. "I am still waiting for her apology." The reference to a long-forgotten, deeply cruel childhood punishment struck Patricia like a physical blow. The absolute finality of the statement confirmed that there would be no corporate bailout, no family settlement, and absolutely no forgiveness. Kira had drawn the ultimate impenetrable boundary. The reporters typed the stinging quote into their digital devices, instantly broadcasting the brutal family exchange to millions of eager viewers across the globe. Kira took another step backward, removing herself entirely from the immediate vicinity of her mother's pathetic breakdown. Down in the front row, the harsh reality of the federal investigation rapidly materialized. The tall, scarred local detective did not wait for another invitation. He aggressively hauled Brittany to her feet, ignoring her frantic, ear-piercing shrieks. The cold, heavy steel handcuffs clicked securely around her delicate wrists, the sharp, metallic sound cutting through her continuous sobbing. Two additional officers stepped forward, firmly gripping Brittany by her elbows and forcefully marching her down the aisle. She wildly twisted her neck, screaming desperately for her mother to do something, but Patricia remained frozen, utterly paralyzed by her own total defeat. Meanwhile, the two grim Internal Revenue Service agents flanked Richard. The disgraced corporate titan was still violently clutching his chest, his breathing shallow and erratic. The federal agents showed zero sympathy for his physical distress. They hauled him up by his expensive suit jacket, loudly informing him that a medical professional would evaluate his condition in federal custody. They marched the broken, sweating patriarch toward the heavy double doors, leading him away to face aggressive questioning regarding his decades of extensive tax fraud and systemic corporate embezzlement. The massive crowd of journalists eagerly surged after the departing suspects, their heavy cameras flashing relentlessly as they chased the sensational arrests out of the grand ballroom. The sudden, chaotic exodus left a wide, empty space directly in front of the illuminated stage. Patricia was left completely, utterly alone. She remained slumped on her bruised knees, her ruined face pressed against the cold wooden floor, sobbing uncontrollably into the suffocating void of her shattered legacy. Every single high society friend had completely abandoned her. Her golden child was currently sitting in the back of a locked police cruiser. Her wealthy husband was facing decades in a federal penitentiary. Kira did not stay to watch her mother weep. She slowly turned her back on the pathetic, kneeling figure. Without a single backward glance, Kira calmly walked off the back of the brightly lit stage and disappeared completely into the quiet, welcoming shadows. Those shadows swallowed her past completely, allowing her to finally step into a brilliant future entirely of her own making. 6 months passed since that explosive, life-altering night in the grand ballroom. The media frenzy that had immediately followed the brutal press conference eventually burned itself out, leaving behind a stark, undeniable reality. The federal indictments were swift and merciless. Trial dates were set for the entire disgraced Wilson family. Richard was currently sitting in a maximum security federal holding facility, facing a towering mountain of irrefutable corporate fraud charges that guaranteed he would never wear a tailored silk suit again. Brittany was anxiously awaiting her own scheduled day in court, her secret offshore accounts completely frozen, her lavish, carefree lifestyle instantly reduced to the bleak, terrifying prospect of immediate federal prison time. The heavy dust had completely settled over the smoking ashes of their once flourishing, deeply corrupt corporate empire. Kira sat comfortably in the lush, meticulously landscaped rooftop garden of her sleek Manhattan penthouse. The crisp morning air carried the faint, energizing hum of the massive city far below. The heavy glass doors behind her slid open, and the joyful, musical sound of young children laughing spilled out onto the bright terrace. DeAndre stepped into the warm sunlight, carrying 2 steaming cups of artisanal dark roast coffee. His energetic twin daughters ran happily past him, immediately distracted by the colorful, blooming butterfly bush growing near the reinforced glass railing. DeAndre looked entirely different than the exhausted, deeply stressed man Kira had spoken to half a year earlier. The heavy, dark circles beneath his kind eyes had completely vanished. He handed Kira a warm ceramic mug and took a seat on the comfortable, expensive outdoor lounge chair right beside her. He was absolutely thriving, free from the crushing, relentless financial abuse and constant emotional manipulation of his highly toxic marriage to Brittany. His own independent architectural firm had just secured 3 major, highly lucrative commercial building contracts. He was finally building the secure, incredibly happy life he and his beautiful daughters truly deserved. Kira took a long, appreciative sip of her hot coffee, the rich, complex flavor perfectly matching the deep, settling satisfaction anchoring into her bones. Her own professional landscape had undergone a massive, truly unprecedented transformation. The highly publicized, brutally efficient takedown of her deeply corrupt parents had inadvertently served as the ultimate, undeniable proof of her ruthless corporate competence and her absolute, unshakable financial integrity. The global market responded with aggressive, overwhelming enthusiasm. Elite investors flooded her independent firm with massive amounts of fresh capital, incredibly eager to partner with the brilliant architect who possessed the tactical genius to successfully dismantle a 30-year corporate fraud syndicate in a single evening. Her company valuation had literally doubled within the incredibly short span of 6 months. She was no longer just a highly successful independent businesswoman. She was an untouchable, incredibly powerful industry titan, universally respected and deeply feared by anyone who foolishly considered crossing her path. DeAndre smiled warmly, watching his girls play safely in the bright morning sun. He thanked Kira again for exposing the horrific, buried truth, quietly acknowledging that her brutal honesty had directly saved his young family from total, unavoidable ruin. Kira simply nodded silently, perfectly understanding that complex words were no longer necessary between them. The heavy, polished wooden door of her private penthouse elevator softly chimed, and her efficient executive assistant stepped out onto the breezy terrace, carrying the sorted morning mail. At the very top of the neat stack sat a crumpled, cheap beige envelope. The smudged return address prominently featured the stark, unmistakable, depressing stamp of the regional county jail. It was from Patricia. The desperate, frantic, scrawled handwriting on the outside pleaded for Kira to please read the contents, begging pathetically for immediate commissary money and a sliver of entirely undeserved mercy. Kira did not flinch or hesitate. She did not feel a single microscopic drop of guilt or any lingering toxic familial obligation. She smoothly picked up the dirty envelope, her perfectly manicured fingers briefly grazing the incredibly cheap, rough paper. She calmly walked over to the heavy-duty industrial shredder tucked discreetly into the corner of her pristine home office. Without opening the sealed envelope, without reading a single pathetic, weeping word of her mother's desperate, lying apologies, Kira dropped the letter directly into the rapidly spinning steel blades. The powerful machine devoured it instantly, reducing Patricia's final weeping plea to a small handful of meaningless, forgotten paper ribbons. Kira stepped gracefully back out onto the sunlit terrace, the cool, refreshing morning breeze gently catching her hair. She looked out over the glittering, endless expanse of the breathtaking city skyline. She quietly sipped her coffee. The peace was absolute. The sweet revenge was complete.